A tangled love story unfolds like a dark detective tale, a crime film, a film noir, with a timeless plot where lust and obsession lead to murder and classic betrayal. This was Jaime's favorite genre, and he played the lead villain. Patricia helped dress him in the costume of a deranged, jealous man, work overalls, gloves, and a stocking mask. Then she, the true star of this film, brilliantly played the victim. Thirsting for authenticity, she cut her own hand and barricaded herself in the bathroom, clutching a real revolver in her bleeding hand to complete the authenticity of her fabricated image. All that was missing was a camera to focus on her wild eyes and feigned horror as she aimed the revolver and fired. On June 25, 2008, at 1:15 a.m., while the residents of Garden Valley, California were peacefully sleeping in their beds, the fire station received a report of a fire blazing along a winding road above a deep gorge. This is a challenging area with many sharp turns, hills, and ravines. Only upon getting closer did the firefighters notice that a burning SUV was at the center of the fire. Their experience told them that the body of the driver might be inside. Unfortunately, they were right. The body, like the entire vehicle, was completely engulfed in flames. Earlier that evening, a report had been made to the emergency services about a missing resident who had gone to buy propane in his Chevrolet Suburban and had not returned. The firefighters could see that the vehicle burning before them was indeed a Suburban. The missing man was 54-year-old Ron Presba. Around 9 p.m., he had left to buy propane for a barbecue and never returned. The remains found at the scene were sent for an autopsy, but officers were able to identify the burned vehicle, and it was indeed Ron's SUV. The news quickly spread throughout Garden Valley. Many people knew Ron personally and were saddened by the news. Initially, everything pointed to the man being the victim of a road accident. On such a rough road, there were many opportunities for a vehicle to go off into the ravine and catch fire. The propane Ron was carrying only added fuel to the blaze. Firefighters found 2 large pools of blood, each more than a meter in diameter, on the road. They speculated that the man had hit a deer, a large animal that could cause such a significant amount of blood. It was hard to imagine a worse place to encounter an animal, a dark, winding road above a deep ravine without any guardrails or barriers. Many people in such situations react by sharply turning the wheels. However, the firefighters could not find the body of the struck animal near the collision site. Moreover, upon closer inspection, the bloodstains looked strange. Between the larger pools of blood were smaller bloodstains, as if something was bleeding, then stopped, then started bleeding again. Nearby, there was a partial footprint and some sort of stain, as if a package or something similar had been lying there. Additionally, there were acceleration marks near the scene, indicating that someone had left the scene in a vehicle, and quickly. Considering these strange findings on the road, the fire investigator suspected that this was not an accident. The suspicions of the fire investigator were confirmed when he found a bag with a reddish liquid near the burned-out vehicle. At first, he mistook it for transmission fluid, but it was strangely covered in flies. Upon closer examination, to his horror, he realized that the bag contained hair, skull fragments, and brain matter. The bag had traces of fire, although the flames hadn't yet reached it. This meant that Ron's vehicle had been set on fire before it went off the ravine. It was likely stopped, set ablaze, and then pushed down the slope. The bag was thrown afterward. This was clearly done intentionally. At the coroner's office, it was confirmed that the victim was Ron Presba. The blood on the road and in the bag also belonged to him. Ron had been murdered, and the fire was used to cover up the crime. Police investigators began their work, and the morning after the body was discovered, they spoke with the victim's wife, Patricia, or Patty. Patty seemed overwhelmed with grief, but was eager to help the police. She said that Ron had no enemies. In fact, someone like him couldn't have had enemies. He was one of the pillars of the Garden Valley community. Everyone saw him as a loving father, devoted husband, very honest, hardworking, reliable, and an all-around wonderful person. Ron would give you the shirt off his back to help someone. He had spent many years building his trucking company before he met Patty. Patty worked for the California Conservation Corps and was part of a program that taught young people who would otherwise get into trouble with the law useful labor skills in firefighting, forest protection, and conservation. It was essentially a work camp for troubled youth. Both Patty and Ron had adult children from previous relationships. The day before, at 4:30 p.m., Patty had gone to visit her daughter and grandchildren who lived an hour away. She called her husband around 9 p.m. and he mentioned that he was going to get propane for the barbecue. However, when she returned at midnight, the house was empty. Ron's daughters told the police that a guest had been staying with the family in recent weeks. This guest was 21-year-old Jaime Ramos. Detectives returned to the family home to speak with Patty again. She confirmed that Jaime Ramos had been living with the family for 3 weeks. He was one of the troubled young people assisted by the California Conservation Corps, and Patty had been his mentor. Jaime Ramos had joined the program a year ago after being charged with assault. Patty and Ron decided to help the young man save money so he could visit his relatives in Texas. Patty described Jaime as a nice guy who had faced many challenges since childhood. His mother had taken her own life when he was just 2 years old. His father was in and out of his life, and after being passed around by various relatives, he eventually went to live with his grandmother, who became like a mother to him. Now Patty had taken on the role of his mentor and friend, and Jaime often sought her advice. She explained that Jaime was finishing his training program at the center, but needed a place to stay for the remaining month. Patty had asked Ron if Jaime could stay in their spare bedroom, and Ron, being a kind-hearted person, agreed. Ron welcomed Jaime into their home and they developed a strong bond, with Ron becoming like a father figure to Jaime. However, just the day before, Jaime had left. They had lent him some money so he could travel to his relatives in Texas. Jaime's sudden departure seemed suspicious, especially since Patty claimed she didn't know how to contact him. In other words, they had lent the young man money, but she had no way to reach him. Before the detectives could ask Patty further questions, something caught their eye. A few drops of blood by the fireplace caught the detectives' attention. Although there weren't many, they deemed it important and called in the forensic team. Upon their arrival, they processed the room with luminol, causing it to light up with traces of blood that someone had attempted to clean. The detectives realized they had stumbled upon the murder scene. Since Patty had an alibi, Jaime seemed the most likely suspect. However, according to Patty, she and Ron had a good relationship with Jaime. Nevertheless, the detectives reached out to Jaime's family in Texas, who said he was still en route but provided his phone number. Over the phone, Jaime confirmed that Ron had become a true friend and mentor to him in a short period. He expressed his desire to help the police uncover the truth about Ron's death. Strangely, though, he refused to disclose his whereabouts. Since Jaime was using a prepaid phone, the police couldn't trace his location. Instead, they tried to gain his trust, encouraging Jaime to keep calling them and persuade him to reveal what he knew about Ron's death. Meanwhile, Curtis Edwards reached out to them. Curtis was also a member of the program helping young people, just like Jaime. Moreover, Jaime was his roommate. Therefore, he knew something that, in his opinion, no one else suspected. Jaime and Patty were having a romance. Curtis was shocked. All the young people in the organization loved Patty, calling her Mom, but Jaime clearly had feelings for her of a different nature. Despite being 21 years old, while she was 47, he was younger than her children. Nonetheless, Jaime asked Curtis not to tell anyone about it. As his friend, Curtis agreed, but now he felt obligated to inform the police. The meeting with the detectives was brief, but its importance for the investigation couldn't be underestimated. Because now the investigators knew that Jaime could have a motive for Ron's murder. It was worth talking to Patty again, because it became clear that she knew more than she was saying. Patty reluctantly admitted that she had been involved with Jaime, but a couple of days before Ron's murder, she ended things with her lover because his behavior was increasingly alarming her. When she brought up the breakup, they were in the car, and Jaime swerved the car as if he wanted to crash into an oncoming vehicle. Fortunately, they avoided the accident, but Patty realized he was willing to do anything just to be with her. At some point, Ron realized that his wife was having an affair, but he reacted as a very understanding person. Ron and Patty agreed to buy Jaime a car so he could go to Texas and stop being part of their lives. Patty and Jaime went to a car dealership to choose a car. Patty told the detectives that they bought the car, packed his things into it, and sent him off to Texas. And this happened just before Ron's murder. Now, however, she was afraid that Jaime would come back to finish what he started, to kill her. However, after reviewing the surveillance camera footage at the dealership, detectives found out that the love affair hadn't ended because Patty and Jaime were holding hands and hugging each other affectionately. But before the investigators could summon the woman for a candid conversation, a new twist emerged in the case. Patty disappeared. A month to the day after Ron's murder, the detectives drove back to the same house. Again, they approached the front door, crossed the threshold once more. The feeling of déjà vu never left them, especially when they saw that the small house had become the scene of another bloody crime. Blood was everywhere, In the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom, even on the doorstep. Chairs were overturned, rugs were displaced as if something had been dragged across the floor. A bloodied kitchen knife lay on the TV stand. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the bathroom door was broken with bullet holes in it. Everything seemed unreal, like a stage set. Amidst this gruesome scene, the detectives found a note made from cut-out magazine letters. They had never seen such notes before, except in movies. It stated that Patty had been kidnapped. Exactly what Patty had feared Jaime would do. The police began their search for the woman and distributed her description to officers. The next day, July 25, 2008, hundreds of kilometers away from the Prespa family home in Salt Lake City, Utah, a patrol officer was checking the registration numbers of cars in a motel parking lot when he noticed a green Hyundai. A quick check revealed that the car was linked to a murder investigation. The officer contacted detectives from California who informed him that two people were associated with this car, Jaime Ramos and Patricia Prespa. Approximately 5 minutes later, the door of the motel room opened and a woman came out. She walked straight to the police officer. He aimed his weapon at her, but the woman stated that she was Patricia Prespa, and she added, "He's in the room, he's been shot." The policeman didn't know what to think and couldn't imagine what he would see when he entered that door. He and his partner burst open the door and shouted, "Police!" But there was no response. Someone was clearly lying on the bed. The policeman demanded that the person raise their hands and come out, but the person didn't move. The officer thought the person under the blanket was dead. He grabbed the blanket and saw that there was a wounded person there. It was Jaime Ramos. He looked at the policeman and said, raising his hands, "Don't shoot. They've already shot me." Both Patricia and Jaime were taken into custody. While Jaime received medical attention, detectives questioned Patricia. Patty claimed that she also became a victim of Jaime. She recounted that she was sleeping in her bed when suddenly she was grabbed by a man wearing a mask made from a stocking, gloves, and a jumpsuit. She managed to break free, but he lunged at her again. They struggled, wreaking havoc around them. It was only when he dragged her into the kitchen that she realized it was Jaime, although she had never seen him like that before. He confessed to her that he had killed her husband, and she would be next. At one point, Jaime attempted to strike her with a large kitchen knife, slashing her hand as she tried to shield herself. However, she managed to reach the bedroom, grabbed a .44 Magnum revolver, and locked herself in the bathroom. Jaime smashed the door, and that's when she fired 3 times. Dropping the weapon, she ran outside, but even after she shot him 3 times with the Magnum, Jaime caught up with her and seized her. Now he had the gun, and he ordered her to get into his car. They stopped several times along the way, notably to refuel. Detectives puzzled over why she didn't escape from the wounded man while he was refueling the car. Patty replied that she was terrified. What happened next was known to the police. Here, the story could have ended, and Patty would have appeared a heroine if Jaime had died from the gunshot wounds. He was indeed close to death when they found him in the hotel, but he received timely medical attention and he was ready to talk to the police. When at the age of 21, Jaime was admitted to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he was given a job, he felt like he had hit the jackpot. He quickly befriended other members of the organization, particularly his roommate Curtis, as well as his supervisor Patty. Initially, he regarded her as a friend and mentor, but soon their relationship became much closer. She didn't immediately confess to Jaime that she was married. Even more so, she didn't tell him how 6 years ago she had to work hard to make Ron fall in love with her when her third husband left her. But she told him that she was living in an unhappy marriage. Jaime's heartstrings were deeply touched by Patty's confessions. The thing was, he himself had been tormented by a male relative for years. It started when he was 6. It started when he was 6 years old, ended at 16, and occurred once or twice a month. Jaime asked Patty to leave her husband, but she always found some excuse why it was impossible. Then she mentioned another option. At first it was like a game, a joke. The woman said, "Do you want me to leave him? What if something unfortunate happens to him? Which we arrange?" Jaime asked incredulously. "What else?" Patty initiated conversations about how Ron liked to work around the house and might fall from a ladder onto something sharp or get hit by a car. It seemed like a joke until she showed her lover an envelope with insurance. And then he realized that everything they talked about was serious. She convinced him that after receiving the money, they could start over. Jaime would go to college first and they would live together. She took out insurance on her husband and was supposed to receive $150,000 in case of his death. But if his death occurred as a result of an accident, the wife would receive $300,000. This is called double insurance. Double Insurance is also the name of a true classic of cinema, a film in which a woman seduces a man and persuades him to kill her husband. And then the seductress shoots the naive lover. Jaime hadn't watched that movie, but Patty clearly understood its essence. Or Oscar Wilde was right, and life ultimately does imitate art. But Jaime had no intention of becoming a murderer, and Patty started pressing him. "Don't you believe me? Don't you believe that he's tormenting me, beating me? Don't you want to live with me?" She didn't leave the man infatuated with her any other choice. So he set her a condition. He had to personally see what Ron was really like. The woman agreed. She told her husband that a guy at work insulted her, but Jaime stood up for her, beat him, and therefore he was expelled from the program. Now he had nowhere to live. Ron, being a kind soul, of course, offered the guy to stay with them. He personally went for Jaime, brought him home, and thanked him for standing up for his wife. He said that Jaime could live with them for free and only asked him to help around the house, because what the guy did for him was already enough payment. So Jaime started living with his mistress and her husband. Ron behaved friendly, taught him how to use various tools, and in general treated the guy like a son. But Jaime was most concerned that Ron never raised his voice to his wife, never scolded her, never refused her anything, and it clearly wasn't a show for the public. Doubts began to creep into his mind. Patty described a monster, but Jaime saw a completely different Ron. However, Patty wasn't about to back down. She skillfully manipulated the guy, convincing him that he was saving her from a cruel husband, and set a date for when Jaime would have to attack Ron. Otherwise, he would have to leave and never see her again. The thought of this was unbearable for Jaime. Tuesday, June 24th came, one of the longest days of the year. That evening, Ron sat calmly in his armchair by the fireplace watching TV. Patty had indeed gone to her daughters, but she kept calling her lover, asking if he had finished with her husband yet and why he was taking so long. She insisted that it would be easier to cover up the evidence if it happened outside, so Jaime told Ron that he heard some noise in the pen with his pigs. Ron, of course, believed him and went to check, but Jaime couldn't bring himself to attack the man. When Ron returned home, he sat back in his favorite armchair. Jaime sat on a chair in the kitchen 3 meters away from him and drank a lot of water, as if delaying what he was about to do, trying to calm down. Patty continued to call, asking when everything would be over. Jaime saw the hammer and decided that if one blow to the head rendered Ron unconscious, it would be enough for him. He took one last sip of water, put on gloves, wiped the hammer. The house was so small. Ron was so close. Jaime told himself, "You're doing everything right." He thought about the violence against Patty, remembered how he himself had been abused, and the anger from the flooding memories allowed him to feel a sharp adrenaline rush. He literally jumped up from the chair, ran to Ron, and struck the man 3 times quickly on the head. Ron barely had time to scream, "Why?" But Jaime seemed to snap. He shouted, "How dare you torment my wife? Yes, Patty is my wife now. How dare you hit her?" He struck the man 3 more times, smashing his skull. Then he dropped the hammer. Amazingly, he felt relieved, knowing that he did it for her. But to do everything as she wanted, the killer had to take the body out of the house and create the appearance of an accident. To put Ron in the driver's seat, he had to build a mini-trap from the ladder and plywood. After that, Jaime sat next to the deceased and directed the car towards the cliff, sitting next to the bloodied man whose head he had just smashed. To distract himself from such a reality, he remembered the movie Sin City. There's a scene where a killer drives down a deserted road with a corpse sitting next to him. But when Jaime watched that movie 3 years ago, he couldn't have imagined he would do something similar. On the way, he threw away Ron's chair, the bloodied carpet, and the hammer. Then at the canyon, he used all the props to prepare the final scene of the accident. He doused the car with gasoline, prepared a propane tank, put the man's foot on the gas pedal, flicked his lighter. It was at that moment that the blood flowing from the car spilled onto the road and created a puddle. Jaime set fire to the SUV and rolled the car down. He noticed a packet. Cleaning up at home, he collected pieces of brain in a packet, and now it fell out of the car. Jaime threw it into the ditch, thinking the fire would destroy it. Then he ran to his car, waiting for him at the cliff, and wanted to drive to Texas, but he couldn't. He had to see her. When he entered the house, Patty was washing her husband's blood in the living room. And right where Ron had been killed a few hours earlier, Patty's 3-year-old granddaughter sat watching cartoons on TV. Patty flew into a rage when she saw him. Jaime asked to hug him goodbye. Patty reluctantly complied, and he finally left. On the way, alone with his thoughts, he began to realize what he had done. He felt very ashamed and sick. Jaime was supposed to go to Texas to be with his relatives, but when the police didn't believe in the accident and began investigating the murder, Patty became nervous. She ordered him to go somewhere they wouldn't find him. Her anxiety multiplied when a month later, Jaime told her he was returning to California. The investigators had traced him back to his grandmother, the woman who raised him and whom he obeyed unquestioningly. She told her grandson that he shouldn't behave as if he were guilty of something and returned to California to talk to the police. Jaime agreed, but on his way back, despite his grandmother's and the investigators' advice, he called Patty. Apparently, that's when Patty realized that he was becoming a problem, and it was time to abandon him to save herself. She listened to Jaime and replied that she had a plan that would allow them to spend the rest of their lives together. Wasn't this what he had always dreamed of? She wanted to make it seem as if Jaime had abducted her. He agreed, thinking they would leave together and lie low for a while. Patty ordered her lover to overturn all the furniture in her house and knock down the bathroom door to make the abduction look more realistic. But she didn't warn him that she would be hiding behind it with a magnum. And as soon as he broke the door, she shot. Once, twice, thrice. She hit his hand, leg, and clavicle area. Jaime was in shock, asking, "How could you do this?" The woman calmly approached and pressed the gun to his head, but the gun didn't fire. While Jaime lay on the floor in blood, she went to another room, tried to fix the gun, but changed her mind and left. For some reason, Jaime decided to follow her. Even more unbelievably, Patty said to him, "Okay, let's go." And they left the state together. The next day, Jaime's car was spotted at a motel in Salt Lake City, and the couple was taken into custody. But Patty wasn't done yet. She still had one last hope, to convince Jaime to take the blame. But how could she do that? Before the trial, Patty and Jaime were held in a small jail together, and the plumbing arrangement of the prison allowed Patty to once again get into the heart and soul of her young lover. If you simultaneously flush the water in the female and male toilets, you can talk as if you are in the same room. Most likely, Patty wasn't the first to discover this, but she cleverly took advantage of this peculiarity, persuading Jaime to stick to her version. Allegedly, at first, she also wished for her husband's death, but changed her mind, and then Jaime killed Ron and abducted her, trying to get rid of the only witness. Remarkably, Jaime was willing to go along with this for her sake. However, when the boy's lawyer learned about it, he intervened and shuffled the cards for Patty. He contacted the only person who could break the spell over the woman, Jaime's grandmother. The grandmother and the beloved aunts of the young man ordered him to tell the whole truth. In the interrogation room, the investigators witnessed the power Patty had over Jaime. Despite her confession and everything she had done, Jaime begged for the opportunity to see her. In June 2009, the preliminary hearing began. Unexpectedly, it turned out that Jaime was not the only one whom Patty had tried to persuade to commit murder. Her friend took the witness stand and told that Patty had asked her if she knew anyone who could go for this crime. But even stranger was that she once wanted to kill her ex-husband and then asked the ex-husband if he would kill Ron. On June 29, 2009, Jaime pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and agreed to testify against Patty. But he did not get such an opportunity. Just a couple of days before the start of the trial in February 2010, she also admitted guilt. She was sentenced to imprisonment from 42 years to life for Ron's murder and attempted murder of Jaime. Jaime was sentenced from 25 years to life. Just before starting his sentence, Jaime met with Ron's 2 daughters and told them that he was a wonderful person. He treated him kindly, and Jaime also managed to love him for the short time he knew him. Yet despite what his own eyes had seen, Jaime chose to believe Patty. She chose an impressionable, vulnerable boy who was not loved in childhood, got into his soul, and made him do what she needed. Los Angeles, California. Every day of every year, young people from all over the country come here, hoping to make their dreams come true. Some want to become movie stars, others dream of singing on stage or working in the fashion industry, but not everyone shares these hopes and dreams. Among the stars, the glitz, and the glamour, there are those who come to Hollywood to escape their past, an unworthy past. In a city where strangers never attract attention, they can easily blend into the crowd. In 2001, the dreams of one girl would be cut short after a night of bloody crime. Her connection with a famous Hollywood actor would turn her death into a sensation. But this story holds much more. Decades of cat-and-mouse games between the police and a calculating killer. A man whose knife pierced not one, but 4 young women. A serial killer who would become known as the Hollywood Ripper or the Boy Next Door. It happened almost 30 years ago in Glenview, Illinois. But even today, the Piccaccio family is haunted by memories of the day they learned that Tricia had been brutally murdered. 18-year-old Tricia Piccaccio had just graduated from high school. On an unusually cool and foggy Friday evening, August 13, 1993, Tricia and her school friends gathered to play a scavenger hunt. Then they all had dinner at a restaurant. Essentially, it was their last meeting before the young people started their university education. After a pleasant evening, the girl returned home a little after 1 in the morning. Holding her keys in her hand, she approached the door, intending to open it, but she never managed to do so. The next morning, her father woke up as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to his van. The cup fell from his hand when his eyes were confronted with a scene too horrific to describe in words. He fell to his knees before his daughter and screamed. His scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, alarming all the neighbors. Despite the apparent futility of his efforts, Tricia's father tried to provide first aid to bring her back to life. When Tricia's mother learned what had happened, she fainted. Later, both parents were taken to the hospital in a state of shock. The police immediately began an investigation. Tricia had obviously been attacked, her arm twisted so severely that it broke, and she had received multiple stab wounds. But who could have wished such a death upon an 18-year-old girl loved by many? The investigators did their utmost, but a year after the murder, they had made no progress. However, about 12 months after Tricia's death, a neighbor's boy began attracting attention with his strange behavior. 17-year-old Michael Gargiulo was the best friend of Tricia's brother, Doug Piccaccio. Right after the incident, his reaction was quite natural. The boy was in shock over the murder of the neighbor girl he personally knew. He practically grew up in the Piccaccio house, often having dinner with the family. And just 2 days before her murder, Michael and another friend, Olson, had given Tricia a ride to her boyfriend's house. Overall, Michael was just a quiet guy to the Piccaccio family, a friend of their son who had never shown any oddities. But a year after Tricia's murder, the teenager started giving gifts to the family. It started with flowers he brought to Tricia's mother. Then he gave her and her husband a gift certificate for a restaurant dinner. And later, he bought Tricia's father a shirt. This was enough for detectives Jack Reed and Mark Baldwin from Cook County, Illinois, to take a closer look at the boy. A psychologist suggested that with these gifts, he was trying to atone for some sin. The detectives learned that Gargiulo had previously been involved in theft. Then Tricia's brother told the police about an interesting conversation he had with Michael. Michael once asked him if he knew who attacked Tricia. Would he be able to kill him? Doug said that the answer was known to any father or brother of a murdered girl. After this conversation, a detective called Doug and said that according to Michael, Doug had threatened him. It seemed that Michael at least knew more than he was saying, and when he was invited for a conversation at the station, he admitted that the morning after the murder, their mutual friend Eric Agazim had come to him and asked for help hiding something in his gym bag. Michael insisted he didn't know what was in the bag, but suspected it was the murder weapon, a knife. The detectives believed Michael, and when Agazim refused to talk to the police, he immediately became their main suspect. However, the investigators could not find any evidence against Eric, and the investigation stalled. For several years, there were no developments in the case. But one day, 5 years after Tricia's murder, Michael Gargiulo appeared on the Piccaccio family's doorstep. Clearly, he was still tormented by what he knew about the case, and he asked Tricia's mother if he could speak with her husband. The man wasn't home, so she let the boy wait for him. When Tricia's father entered the house, he immediately understood from Michael's face that they were in for a serious conversation. But before they could exchange even a few words, the door opened and Michael's father and one of his sisters came in. Without providing any explanation, they just took the boy away with them. Tricia's father immediately contacted the police and said they should talk to Michael again, but they were too late. Michael Gargiulo had left Glenview. Hollywood, 2001. 8 years and thousands of miles from the murder of Tricia Piccaccio. The bright lights of Hollywood have always attracted the young and beautiful, 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was no exception. For a girl from a small town in Northern California, life in Los Angeles was full of opportunities, new acquaintances, and entertainment. Ashley studied at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Naturally, she dreamed of working in the fashion industry. In the meantime, she loved having fun with her close-knit group of friends who always spent time together. One evening, the beautiful and smiling girl caught the eye of a rising Hollywood star, 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. The young people had crossed paths at parties thrown by mutual friends, so when Ashton invited Ashley out to dinner, no one was surprised. They spoke on the phone and agreed that he would pick her up and they would go to a restaurant together. Ashton arrived at about 10:45 p.m. The lights were on in all the rooms, and the young man confidently knocked on the door, but the girl did not open it. He knocked again, but again there was no response. Ashton thought he was too late. Ashley got upset and left with friends. However, before leaving, he peeked through the window by the door. The apartment was a bit messy, but Ashley had just moved in, and that was quite natural. He also saw red wine spilled on the carpet. Not giving it much thought, Ashton went home. As we know now, it was not wine at all. The body of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered by her neighbor early Thursday morning. The girl entered the house and almost immediately saw her friend lying on the floor, blue and covered in blood. Fearing that the killer might still be in the house, she ran outside and called emergency services. But she was in vain to hurry. The killer had long since disappeared, and it was too late to help Ashley. Detectives who arrived at the crime scene, Tom Small, were confronted with a gruesome sight. Even after so many years, they clearly remember seeing an enormous amount of blood, with Ashley lying a little further away. They marveled at the rage the killer must have been in to stab her 47 times. But what astonished the detectives even more was what they didn't see, any clues that would tell them which direction to move. Ashley's friends provided the detectives with one and only one hint in this case, telling them about a young man who had lived next door to Ashley a few months ago. He introduced himself to her as Michael, a heating and air conditioning repairman. When Ashley's friend's heater broke, they invited Michael over. When he appeared at their house, the young man mentioned that he was a professional boxer. But when he first arrived in Hollywood in 1998, like many other young people, he nurtured another dream, to make it big on the screen. Quite quickly, he achieved a certain level of success in this field, landing a small role as a boxer in 1999. He handled it excellently, but something strange happened behind the camera. He behaved distantly, maybe even a bit shy, and didn't talk to anyone, keeping to himself. He seemed to have two sides to his personality. On one side, he was a clumsy guy with a lot of insecurities, but upon closer acquaintance, it became clear, if he wanted something, he would achieve it at any cost, shutting off all emotions. Michael had even once been arrested for theft, and it was this manner of behavior that puzzled Ashley and her friends. Ashley was a beauty, always open to communication, but Michael never invited her on a date or flirted with her. It seemed as if he was interested not in her, but in the lifestyle she led. Hanging out with actors like Vin Diesel and Jeremy Sisto, he became fixated on her. This wasn't particularly strange in itself, but one time, Ashley's friend Justin caught Michael sitting in his car at night across from her house, watching her apartment. The next day, when Michael dropped by, Justin directly asked him what it all meant. Michael's response shocked him. He allegedly couldn't go home because FBI agents from Chicago were waiting there to take DNA samples from him in connection with the murder of his best friend's girlfriend. Naturally, Justin suggested that Michael give a DNA sample if he had nothing to hide. Unexpectedly, Michael put his foot on the couch and showed a knife in a sheath, hinting that he was involved in the murder. Justin got angry and kicked the guy out of the house. Ashley and her friends brushed off Michael's story as another one of his tall tales. But what no one knew at the time was that it was true. Besides being an aspiring actor, amateur boxer, and heating repairman, Michael Gargiulo was also the prime suspect in the murder of Trisha Pacaccio. When Michael Gargiulo left Chicago, Illinois, he surely thought he was leaving the murder of Trisha far behind. But wherever he went, a new body would appear. In 2005, 12 years after Trisha's murder and 4 years after Ashley's death, Gargiulo was living in the Los Angeles suburb of El Monte. By this time, the cases of both Ashley and Trisha had been largely forgotten. But by a sinister twist of fate, yet another young woman was found dead in her apartment just steps away from Gargiulo's new residence. 32-year-old Maria Bruno had come to the United States from El Salvador and married young. Maria and her husband were raising 2 children aged 4 and 5, and one set of twins when they made the difficult decision to separate. The children stayed with their father while Maria adjusted to her new life. One fateful day, an unknown assailant removed the protective screen from the kitchen window of her ground-floor apartment, grabbed a knife right there on the spot, and entered the bedroom where she was peacefully sleeping. A woman of delicate build, defenseless, she lay asleep in the bedroom of her apartment, the very place where she should have felt completely safe. This attack was a nightmare for any woman, but it also became a nightmare for any detective because the perpetrator left behind a horrific scene. The ferocity with which the unknown attacker assaulted Maria was phenomenal. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery and a sexual motive. As with Ashley, Maria had no enemies capable of such an act. But this time, the assailant left something behind. Near the apartment, forensic experts found a booty with a drop of Maria's blood and an unknown person's DNA on it. This was both a clue and a dead end. No other evidence was found. Detectives, Mark Littlefield, immediately realized that investigating this case would be challenging. What they couldn't know at that moment was that another woman would have to face the killer to solve this crime. On April 28th at 12:30 a.m., a call came into the police reporting a stabbing. The victim was 26-year-old Michelle Murphy. On that day, she was alone in her apartment because her roommate was away. The story of what she went through sounds eerily familiar, but this woman was not ready to give up without a fight. At around 11:40 p.m., an intruder entered her apartment through a slightly open window. Once inside, he opened the front door, preparing an escape route. He then calmly walked to the bedroom. The man simply began stabbing Michelle, managing to strike her several times in the chest, shoulder, and right arm. Michelle woke up to the blows being inflicted by the intruder looming over her. For a moment, she didn't know whether it was a dream or if it was really happening. Realizing that she was in mortal danger, she tried to wrest the knife from him. She continued to attempt to grab the weapon, even as her hands bled from deep wounds. For a while, Michelle and the intruder struggled until she managed to pull her legs up to her chest and push him away. Understanding that he couldn't overpower Michelle, the intruder fled, not forgetting to say, "I'm sorry," before leaving. The perpetrator managed to escape before the police arrived, but during the struggle with Michelle, he cut himself with his own knife, leaving a long trail of blood as he fled. About 25 days after the detective sent the blood sample to the lab, forensic experts reported a DNA match. The DNA matched Michael Gargiulo perfectly. Within 24 hours, Gargiulo was arrested and charged with attempted murder. What stunned the detectives was where he lived, right across the street from Michelle. But Gargiulo's arrest for the attack on Michelle was only the beginning. The investigation would finally connect a series of unsolved murders that had begun 15 years earlier. It was evident that Michael Gargiulo wasn't particularly surprised when he was arrested by Sergeant Richard Lewis for the attempted murder of Michelle on the evening of June 6, 2008, as he specifically asked which department the officers represented. The fact that he wasn't sure which crime he was being arrested for was intriguing in itself. His question had a basis, as Michael Gargiulo's DNA had been found in the national database. It was entered there by the Cook County Police in Illinois. The Santa Monica detectives contacted Illinois investigators to find out why they had done so and learned that Gargiulo was suspected of murder. The Santa Monica investigators discovered that in 2002, Cook County Police, who had continued to investigate the Tricia Pacaccio case, asked the Los Angeles police for help in obtaining Michael's DNA. By an amazing coincidence, they approached Detective Tom Small, who was investigating Gargiulo's involvement in the murder of Ashley Ellerin. It took the detective over a year to locate the elusive air conditioning repairman, linking him to Tricia's case. And 5 years later, that very DNA sample would help connect Gargiulo to the attack in Santa Monica. But that was far from the end of the story. The Santa Monica investigators called the El Monte police, suspecting that the attack on Michelle might be related to the murder of Maria Bruno. The El Monte detectives returned to Gargiulo's old apartment to search it and found the missing shoe cover. The unknown DNA found on one shoe cover also matched Gargiulo. With the necessary evidence in hand, the detectives had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The Los Angeles prosecutor decided that there was enough evidence to start a case against Michael Gargiulo. On September 4, 2008, while Mike was in jail for the attack in Santa Monica, he was charged with the additional murders of Ashley and Maria. However, the California investigators could not find an answer to one question. Why didn't the Cook County Police in Illinois arrest him years ago for Trisha's murder, thus preventing the deaths of 2 more girls? After all, in 2003, the police had linked the DNA sample obtained by Los Angeles detectives to the unknown DNA found under Trisha's nails. These were the pieces of evidence that could have helped arrest him. Even Trisha's family was confident that this was solid evidence, but the prosecutor decided not to open the case, arguing that the DNA alone was not enough to prove that Gargiulo was at the crime scene when Trisha was attacked. The DNA could have been left not only during the struggle for her life, but also after a casual touch. Mike was a family friend and often visited the house, which was the main obstacle in accusing Mike of Trisha's murder. The prosecutor's office explained that since the lab used one swab to collect DNA from Trisha's nails, it was impossible to determine whether the DNA was on the nails or under them. The difference in this case was enormous. A simple but evidently imperfect laboratory procedure tied the prosecutor's hands. Michael wasn't charged with Trisha's murder until 2011, when a man who worked as a bouncer at a Los Angeles nightclub with Gargiulo recalled seeing him in the news and remembered that Gargiulo had boasted to him and another club employee about killing a girl in Chicago. Gargiulo did not mince words, describing how he committed the crime and allowed her father to find her on the doorstep. After receiving the men's testimonies, the Illinois prosecutor charged Michael Gargiulo with Trisha's murder. This was the news the Piccaccio family had been waiting to hear for 18 years. It didn't ease their pain, but the thought that the guilty party would be punished brought some relief. Gargiulo, evidently doubting that he would be found innocent, planned to escape from El Monte jail. He made makeshift handcuffs out of plastic and intended to attack a guard, steal a police car, and flee to Mexico. However, his plan failed, and he spent several years in Los Angeles jail awaiting trial. After several delays, the trial began on May 2, 2019. It lasted 3.5 months, with over 200 people testifying. Among them was Ashton Kutcher, who recounted the night 18 years ago when he arrived at Ashley Elleren's door moments after she had been killed. Kutcher testified clearly and directly. He had met Ashley 2 months earlier at a friend's party. At that time, he was in a relationship, but by the time Ashley invited him to her housewarming party 2 weeks later, he had broken up with his girlfriend. Ashley was also single, so Ashton asked her out to dinner. He arrived at her place quite late because he had been watching the Grammy Awards with friends. When Ashley didn't open the door, he simply went home. Upon learning that she had been murdered, Ashton immediately called the police and informed them that his fingerprints were on her door. Michelle Murphy also testified. She recalled the night of the attack and then spoke about the immense happiness she felt when she became a mother after everything that had happened. However, all she could think about were the parents of Trisha, Ashley, and Maria, whose daughters had been so heartlessly taken from them by this monster. After giving her testimony, she went downstairs to her husband, hugged him, and cried. Gargiulo's lawyer built his defense on the claim that his client was mentally ill and did not understand what he was doing. However, the prosecution proved that Gargiulo had stalked his victims for a long time, waited for the right moment to attack, and planned each assault meticulously, knowing how to avoid punishment. This indicated that he knew exactly what he was doing. Additionally, a former friend of Michael's testified that Gargiulo frequently searched the internet for information on forensics and how to evade punishment for crimes. The prosecutor argued that there was indeed an intimate component to his attacks, even though he did not sexually assault the women. It was the killings themselves that brought him pleasure. On August 15, 2019, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On July 16, 2021, he was sentenced to the highest penalty. He will be extradited to Illinois, where he will face trial for the murder of Trisha Piccaccio. In Illinois, the punishment for first-degree murder ranges from 25 years to life imprisonment. The psychologist who was asked to analyze Gargiulo's attacks stated that the similarities between the crimes allowed for identifying the characteristic features of his murders. First and foremost, there was the audacity of the attacks. He did not strike in the dead of night but chose times when neighbors or passers-by could see him. Additionally, attacking with a knife involved very close contact, allowing him to look his victims in the eyes. What he did to the young women allowed him to strip them of their identity and humiliate their human dignity. The psychologist suggests that since they were neighbors and he could frequently observe the beautiful women, he put them on a pedestal. At the same time, he harbored a kind of contempt for them because he desired them, which gave the women power over him. Gargiulo felt the need to rectify this situation. He believed he could regain control only in the most horrifying way, not just by killing them, but by stripping away all their humanity. During one of the interrogations, Michael remarked that just because 10 women were killed and his DNA was found on them, it didn't mean he had killed anyone. This statement, along with testimonies from other witnesses, led the police to suspect that Michael might be responsible for the deaths of 10 people, even though he is officially accused of only 4 attacks. Since Michael Gargiulo traveled between Illinois and California, detectives believe there could be more victims. The meeting went well. Janine smiled satisfactorily. She was sitting in the car with her friend Becky and a new acquaintance introduced to her by Becky. Janine was facing difficulties with her rapidly growing real estate business, and the man was supposed to help her. They met in the car due to the busy schedule of the women and to drive by and discuss one of the houses owned by Janine's real estate agency. They agreed on everything, and Janine was sure that the rough patch would soon be over. She would go on a cruise, and when she returned, work would fall into place, and she would receive $1 million, which she would put into new projects. Smiling happily in anticipation of change, Janine opened the car door and stepped out into the parking lot. But before she could take a few steps, she realized that none of her dreams were meant to come true. Janine Lee Monsell, 28, met Max Jones, 31, in early 1991. It was a fateful encounter. Until then, Janine had been desperately unlucky in love. She had been married twice before and was raising a son on her own. But with Max, everything was different. He was reliable and faithful, and they immediately developed feelings for each other. It only took them a few months to decide that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. Janine and Max's wedding took place quite modestly in a local church in October of the same year, 1991. Soon after, their family began to grow. The following summer, their son Zach was born, and 2 years later, their daughter Alexandria, who everyone called Alex, arrived. The family lived modestly, but they managed to make ends meet. Janine tried several jobs. She tried working as a nurse and selling various goods, but her job failures were offset by her husband's stable income. Max was not only talented, but also hardworking as a carpenter. His skills were highly valued and he was never idle. Moreover, he never turned down extra work, and although the family didn't live extravagantly, they stayed afloat. The couple lived in a modest house in Northport, Florida, where they raised their children, attended church, and participated in the local community. They had many friends, were loved and respected by their neighbors, and seemed genuinely happy together. But soon, the situation took a sharp turn. In 1997, Janine got a job as a guard in a prison, but it led to a huge scandal. She engaged in a romantic relationship with an inmate, and after someone complained about their relationship, they were caught in the act, so to speak. Their prolonged affair was confirmed when letters from Janine to her lover were found in the inmate's cell. Though they were signed with a different name, it wasn't hard to establish their true author. To prevent further scandal and numerous interrogations, Janine resigned. But secrets are hard to keep, and rumors quickly reached her husband. Janine and Max had a falling out. It was a double blow for Max. Firstly, his wife had been unfaithful to him. Secondly, she had once again lost a job that provided a decent supplement to the family, which was barely making ends meet financially. The couple decided not to split up for the sake of their children, but trust was lost forever. They tried to pretend that everything was still the same, but longtime friends saw through the facade. It was just for show. One of the close individuals to the family was John Chamberlain. He met the couple at church, and since then, the two hard-working men, Max, working as a carpenter, and John, a locksmith, became best friends. Over the years, John observed how the spouses drifted apart. Janine and Max lived together, but besides their children and property, they had nothing in common. But gradually, even though love had long vanished from their relationship, the situation more or less stabilized. The children grew up, and each of the spouses socialized with their own circle of friends. In 2011, Max began to suffer from stomach problems, which led to a significant weight loss and multiple hospitalizations. However, doctors were at a loss and couldn't find the cause of his illness. Prior to this, he had never complained about health issues. The family did everything possible to alleviate Max's condition, hoping that doctors would soon understand what was wrong. But they were completely unprepared for how it would all end. Just 3 days after Thanksgiving in 2011, the family found Max near death. He was lying in bed, pale and unresponsive. Janine called 911. The dispatcher instructed her on how to administer first aid to Max, and Alexandria followed the instructions. Unfortunately, Max passed away in his daughter's arms. Paramedics arrived minutes later, but they couldn't do anything to help. Max died from a heart attack at the age of 52. Family and friends were shocked by his sudden death. They knew he was ill, but they thought it was related to his stomach. The news of the heart attack came as a thunderbolt out of the blue. It was very difficult for Zach and Alexandria, who were 19 and 17 years old respectively, to cope with the loss of their father. Nevertheless, a doctor signed the death certificate, and Max was cremated 2 days later. Now, it was up to Janina to provide for the family. Considering her previous employment difficulties, it seemed like an insurmountable task for her. But to everyone's surprise, she not only managed but also significantly improved the family's financial situation. Of course, a big help was the $1 million insurance payout she received after her husband's death. But she didn't just sit on it. Using the money, she opened a real estate agency and began renovating and renting out homes. Like many cities in the USA, Northport experienced a real estate boom in the early 2000s. But the 2008 crisis hit the real estate sector hard, and many homes were foreclosed by banks. They stood abandoned, waiting for new owners. These homes became an opportunity for someone like Janine, who had the money to take advantage of the situation. Naturally, Janine also found herself and her children a better place to live. Explaining her actions by the need to move on, she sold the house and all of her late husband's belongings, including his musical and work tools, which he cherished dearly. But it didn't stop there. She began spending a lot of time with her new friend Becky. She drank, used drugs, and spent money on travels, cars, and even a second home in the Great Smoky Mountains area in Tennessee. To those who knew her behavioral changes seemed astonishing. It seemed strange to acquaintances that one could forget a husband with whom Janine had spent 20 years so quickly. Finally, changes awaited Janine in her personal life as well, when she met Matthew Riley Smith, a cable television installation technician. Matthew was only 26 years old. He was half Janine's age and only a few years older than her son. Nevertheless, in July 2012, Janine announced to everyone that she and Matthew had married during a recent trip to Las Vegas. Zach and Alexandria didn't like that their mother had remarried so hastily, especially considering that Max had passed away less than a year ago. They tried not to conflict with Matthew because he hadn't done anything wrong to them, but they disapproved of their mother's eagerness to move on so quickly. Nevertheless, Matthew Smith became a part of Janie Ain's personal life and business, but Matthew's help turned out to be insufficient. In fact, the business was so successful that Janine soon needed an employee, and she turned to her old friend, John Chamberlain. Besides being a locksmith, he had many other skills necessary for home repairs. Janine offered John a job with the condition that he and his 11-year-old daughter would live in one of her houses and pay a very low rent. It was a lucrative offer, and John agreed. Everything went well for a few months, but soon doubts began to creep into the man's mind. John Chamberlain was particularly troubled by the number of houses where all his work involved drilling the lock on the front door. Janine reassured him that this was just a routine part of the job. Since the houses had been empty for a long time, there was no way to contact the previous owners and obtain keys. But John wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Nevertheless, he continued to do repairs for Janine, not taking any action, until one significant moment. His worst fears were confirmed when he answered a call from one of Janine's tenants. The tenant told him that a stranger had just knocked on their door and inquired about what they were doing in his house. To get to the bottom of the situation, John gave the tenant Janine's personal number. Within minutes, she called him back and was furious. John told her that if she was involved in something illegal, he didn't want to be a part of it. In response, she ordered him to vacate the house and sent Matt to deliver the message in person. The encounter between the men ended in a fight. Janine sent John an eviction notice, but he refused to leave, and the matter went to civil court. Additionally, John went to the police. He met with detectives and told them about his involvement in Janine's business, which he believed to be illegal. They listened carefully and said they believed his suspicions. This encouraged him to also share suspicions about the death of Max Jones. Despite Max's stomach problems, his heart attack came as a surprise, and it seemed that Janine wasn't grieving at all. She had remarried a younger man and was living a luxurious lifestyle. But what troubled him the most was that Janine had cremated Max within 2 days of his death without allowing an autopsy, and she found no better way to deal with Max's ashes than to hand the urn to John. Thanks to John Chamberlain's tip-off, the police began monitoring Janine, hoping to learn more about her suspicious business and the death of her third husband. And the police found something. Although Janine and Matt were renovating and renting out properties, they had no connection to any of these houses. They hadn't purchased them or obtained ownership rights to rent them out. Janine would go to the tax assessor's office and file documents formally renouncing her rights to the properties, but with a forged signature. Considering she was renovating and spending large sums of money on the houses, who wouldn't believe they belonged to her? All that was left was to drill the locks, tidy up the house a bit, and it could be rented out. She deceived unsuspecting people out of tens of thousands of dollars, and she even gave them a prepaid phone number to avoid leaving any traces to her. So she was enraged when Jon gave the tenants her real phone number. Her business was a scam from start to finish. Furthermore, Janine didn't have a license to work as a realtor. But that was just the beginning of the investigation. The screws were tightening around Janine, and she made a desperate attempt to get free. Although it's unknown for certain if Janine knew that John had gone to the police, she decided that the legal proceedings with him posed enough of a threat to her business to take action. Whom did she decide to turn to with her problem? Of course, to her best friend Becky. She told her that John was too informed about her affairs, and the court proceedings were costing her too much money, so they needed to deal with him. Becky promised to help. She had acquaintances, not always acting within the law, and one of them could help solve this sensitive issue. On February 20th, 2013, Becky and Janine met for lunch at a restaurant to discuss the details. They needed to make sure they understood their plan before Becky introduced her friend to her acquaintance. During lunch, Janine described John Chamberlain's appearance, gave his address, and even drew a schematic of the house on a napkin with indications of the best points from which to enter. Janine insisted that the matter needed to be resolved as quickly as possible. She planned to go on a cruise and wanted to ensure she wasn't in town during the murder to have an alibi. Becky promised to pass the information to the hitman, and 5 days later organized a meeting with him. On February 25th, Becky and Janine met with the executor, got into his car, and discussed the final details. Janine handed the man a photo of John Chamberlain and said it would be preferable to break his neck to keep the crime scene clean. In the worst case, he could be shot. The main thing was to get rid of the body. As she added, if the body can't be found, nothing can be proven. They drove past John's house where she explained how to break in and warned about any possible threats, such as the man's 11-year-old daughter. Waving her hand, she stated that the girl didn't concern her, and if she got in the way, they should deal with her too. The important thing was that her body wasn't found either. The driver stopped the car in the parking lot and at some point asked Becky to step out of the car to discuss the final details of the matter alone with Janine. As if the random victim in the form of an 11-year-old girl wasn't horrifying enough, by the end of the meeting, Janine made another chilling proposition. She asked if she could get 2 for the price of 1. She was tired of her fourth husband, Matthew Smith, and wished to rid herself of the burden and threat. Just on January 3rd, his life insurance policy worth $1 million came into effect, and he would be more useful to her dead than alive. Janine proposed getting rid of him a couple of weeks after John, but in his case, it was harder to accomplish because he might have a weapon on him, and there were surveillance cameras in the house. She suggested staging his murder as a carjacking. The killer agreed to all her terms, and she agreed to pay $4,000 for each man. She brought $1,000 with her, ready to hand it over immediately to confirm her seriousness of intentions. When the meeting was over, a satisfied Janine got out of the car. Seconds later, she was surrounded by police officers and arrested. Her initial fear and shock quickly turned to anger as she realized she had fallen into a classic police trap. For the past few weeks, she had been the subject of an investigation under the codename Black Widow, and it was all because John wasn't the only one who went to the police. Janine's best friend, Becky, was also cooperating with the detectives. While she did have connections in the city's underworld, she chose to take a different path. An informant called the police, reporting that his friend wanted to report a planned contract killing. This friend turned out to be Becky. When they were discussing the murder details in the restaurant and Janine was drawing the victim's house plan, Becky had a microphone and camera on her. In the car, she introduced Janine to Officer Dominic Harris, who of course recorded the entire conversation. The man needed Janine to do several things that would later help convict her. He needed Janine to provide a photo of John Chamberlain. She had to show where he lived. She had to say how she wanted him to be killed. They needed to discuss the cost of the hit. He needed Janine to give money for the murder. The man played his role perfectly, even though it was difficult for him to hide his shock and disgust when Janine casually dismissed John's daughter as a nuisance and later talked about Matt's murder. Janine was charged with 2 counts of solicitation to commit murder and faced 33 charges related to her business, ranging from robbery to criminal use of personal information and operating as a realtor without proper authorization. Her husband, Matt Smith, was horrified when he was told that his wife had planned to have him killed. He himself was arrested on March 15th, 2013. Initially, he was reluctant to cooperate, but the 30 charges of fraud persuaded Matt, and he offered to testify against Janine. In exchange for his testimony against his wife, he was offered a great deal. In January 2014, after spending 6 months in prison, he pleaded guilty to only 1 charge. He was sentenced to 4 years of probation and ordered to pay $17,500 to the victims of their scam. However, Matt never got to testify in court. In May 2014, Janine announced that she didn't want to contest the charge. This means that she doesn't admit guilt, but is willing to accept the punishment that the judge will impose. Janine claimed that her impulsive decision to hire a hitman was influenced by drugs and alcohol, and that she was not a danger to society. However, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Of course, the police tried to investigate her involvement in the death of Max Jones. When John Chamberlain approached the police, they listened carefully to him and didn't dismiss his words because they had heard the name Janine Jones before. They had witness statements claiming that Janine Jones had approached them to obtain drugs that, in their opinion, were used to kill Max. However, in the state of Florida, if a doctor signs a death certificate stating that the death occurred due to natural causes, an autopsy cannot be performed. Not to mention that the quick cremation of the body deprived the police of any evidence. Officially, Max Jones died of a heart attack. As prophetically stated by Janine herself, if there's no body, you can't prove anything. Unfortunately, she was right about that. Nevertheless, Max's loved ones believe that it is right for her to spend the rest of her life in prison. During Janine's sentencing, John Chamberlain sat next to Max's father. When the judge rendered her decision and said that Janine would never be released, Max's father turned to John, placed his hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for achieving justice for my boy." Kauai is the Hawaiian island garden rightfully bearing the title of one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Tourists come here to enjoy an unforgettable vacation, with jagged coastal cliffs, lush tropical forests, and no one notices the not-so-young man, alone, handing out leaflets and telling the story of his brutally murdered daughter, Sandra. When Sandra Gallus was found strangled, the police quickly narrowed down the suspects to 2. The case seemed crystal clear and straightforward, but it took many years before justice prevailed, all thanks to one determined father. Standing at his daughter's grave, he vowed that as long as he lived, she would not be forgotten, and her case would be solved. This is the story of a father who remained the driving force behind the investigation, setting himself the goal of securing the conviction of his daughter's killer and allowing nothing to stand in his way. Sandra, the daughter of Toshi and Larry Mendonca, was born in Japan, her mother's homeland. However, the family later decided to move to the island of Kauai, closer to Larry's parents, as they were getting older and needed assistance. The family lived on a ranch, and Sandra and her older brother Lawrence Jr. adored the place. Few children could boast of having a waterfall right by their home. They spent a lot of time walking on the beach, swimming, and when they got hungry, they were surrounded by 2 fruit orchards where mangoes and citrus fruits grew. Sandra was very determined, responsible, and achieved her goals. From the age of 5, Sandra practiced gymnastics, performed in a cheerleading group at school, continued to participate in sports, and attended numerous clubs and groups, all while being raised in an environment that valued both Japanese and Portuguese traditions. The family's father, Larry, was a veteran of the Air Force, raising his children with discipline. In fact, he sought to instill independence and self-reliance in his daughter and son, insisting that Sandra pursue her higher education in Honolulu. The city seemed enormous to the girl from the small island, but she missed her native island of Kauai and her family, and visited as often as she could. It was during one of these visits that she met Darren. During the summer break of 1999, Sandra found temporary work at a transportation company where she met her future husband, Darren Gallus. She was 21, he was closer to 30, and he immediately captivated the young, inexperienced girl. She fell head over heels for him, dropped out of university, and soon the young couple got married. 9 months later, their first child, Austin, was born, followed by Braden 2 years later. Sandra adored her boys, and the family life seemed happy until April 2005, when she went to her parents, visibly distraught. She told them that while she was taking things out of her husband's backpack, 2 slips of paper fell out, each with a different phone number. Sandra called these numbers and found out they belonged to 2 different married women. She demanded an explanation from her husband. He didn't admit to anything, insisting that he only had friendly relationships with the women. But Sandra knew it was a lie and realized she couldn't forgive her husband. By June, Darren had moved out of the family home, leaving Sandra to deal with the bills on her own. She began searching for work and landed a job as an assistant manager at a highly popular restaurant, considered one of the island's landmarks. Sandra seamlessly integrated into the restaurant staff, earning the appreciation of her colleagues, who joyfully watched as the quiet girl from the small island transformed into a confident, independent woman. She changed her image, spending more time with friends and relishing her newfound freedom. Moreover, she started receiving attention from one of the restaurant's chefs named Ryan Shinjo, who had recently moved to Kauai from Oahu. Sandra found these attentions very pleasing. Sandra's relationship with Ryan was nothing like her relationship with her ex-husband. The couple spent a lot of time together, going out, relaxing, attending concerts, and even traveling to Honolulu for shopping trips, where Ryan spoiled Sandra with expensive gifts, such as Louis Vuitton suitcases. It seemed that Sandra was very happy with her new boyfriend, and a new beautiful chapter of her life had begun. This continued until January 25, 2006, when Sandra's boss called her parents asking if they knew where their daughter was because she hadn't shown up for work. It was unusual for Sandra to miss work and not answer calls, but her parents, who were visiting her older brother in Dallas at the time, weren't worried, thinking she might have some urgent matters to attend to. However, at 3 o'clock in the morning, another call came in, a time when bad news usually arrives. Sandra's brother answered the call. Their father understood everything when he heard his son's prolonged scream, "No!" He would never forget that cry, dividing his life into before and after the murder of his daughter. Sandra was found by her boyfriend Ryan. Since no one could reach her at 9:30 p.m., he went to check if she was home. The door was locked and no one answered. However, he went around the house, looked through the ventilation gap below the garage, and thought he saw a girl in the car. He couldn't open the garage himself, so he called a friend who quickly arrived with tools. Sandra was indeed lying in the car. She was slumped to the right on the passenger seat, face down. Her body had long gone cold. Sandra's shirt and bra were twisted. Bruises adorned her face. Her lip was split, and there were clear marks on her neck from strangulation. She had been choked with something thin, resembling fishing line. However, the arriving police officers couldn't find anything resembling a murder weapon. The girl was killed early in the morning, 10 hours before Ryan arrived. But it was impossible to determine the exact time of death. All of Sandra's belongings, including her phone, remained in place. Nothing was missing from her purse, car, or home. There were also no signs of violence. In other words, it was obvious that whoever killed Sandra did so in a fit of rage. Fingerprints of Darren and Ryan were found, but since one of them had lived in the house until recently and the other had been in a relationship with her, it didn't raise suspicions. However, the fact that Ryan found the body raised questions. Why didn't he call 911 immediately and instead first asked a friend to come over? This wouldn't be the first time a killer tries to establish an alibi by enlisting a friend's support. During questioning, Ryan behaved strangely, clearly nervous, and officers felt he was withholding something. However, he had an alibi. He was at work, confirmed by his colleagues. Darren, on the other hand, was more intriguing. That morning, he called in sick to work, essentially lacking an alibi. Darren showed no reaction to Sandra's death but told investigators that he still loved his wife and wanted to reconcile. His colleagues revealed that 2 days before the murder, Darren, working on the road, saw Sandra and Ryan together as they drove past in her car. Witnesses said Darren exploded with rage. He was furious, tearing and throwing things. In other words, he had a motive and lacked an alibi for the time of the murder. He was detained, but the next day, lacking additional evidence, he was released. Days, weeks, and months passed without any progress in the case. Crushed by loss and yearning for answers, Sandra's father, Larry Mendonca, began his own investigation. A local resident and former military man, he had the connections and skills to piece together all the facts surrounding his daughter's murder. At that time, and this is crucial for the case, Sandra and Darren were disputing custody of their 2 sons. But Sandra worked evenings at the restaurant, and the boys stayed overnight with Darren. Sandra would pick them up at 6 in the morning, feed them breakfast, and get them ready for school and daycare. However, Larry learned that on the evening before her murder, Sandra stayed overnight at her boyfriend's house. He drove her home around 6 in the morning. Then, according to neighbors, she went to pick up the boys and quickly returned, but without the children. Larry also discovered that at 10 o'clock, his daughter had an appointment for a manicure at a salon 45 minutes away from her home. She never showed up. This helped narrow down the time frame when she was killed, from 6:30 to 9:15 in the morning, when she needed to leave to make it to the salon. Since Ryan had an alibi and Darren didn't, Larry's thoughts moved in the same direction as the investigators. Darren must have been the one to kill Sandra. There was no one else. Sandra's friend confirmed that many of her friends were convinced Darren would be arrested and convicted. The children would be placed under the custody of their grandparents or Sandra's brother, and everything would be resolved. But the police were in no hurry to press charges. Then, a year after the murder, news of an arrest spread. But it wasn't Darren. The island of Kauai is unique in many aspects, particularly in its lack of mass media. In most cases, news spreads the same way it did generations ago, through word of mouth, where facts, rumors, and speculations intertwine into a single narrative. Thus, across the island, new information began to circulate. FBI agents had arrested Ryan Shinjo. However, it wasn't in connection with the murder, but rather with illicit substances. Ryan turned out to be a member of a major organization smuggling these substances to the island from Honolulu. It involved significant amounts of money and serious shipments, and FBI agents had been monitoring Ryan for months. Rumors and speculations began to spread across the island. Could Ryan have used his girlfriend as an unsuspecting carrier of the goods? After all, he bought her Louis Vuitton suitcases. Did she unknowingly bring something back from their trip that she wasn't aware of? What if she discovered the truth and she was killed to prevent her from going to the police? Rumors abounded, but the police didn't come any closer to catching the girl's killer, whoever they might be. The case faded away with each passing year. Meanwhile, Larry and Toshi faced the painful reality of not only losing their daughter but also their grandchildren. When their mother was killed, they were only 3 and 5 years old. Darren no longer needed to fight for custody, and he raised the children on his own. Initially, the grandchildren would visit their grandparents on weekends, but within 3 months, they started protesting against these trips. Larry persisted in trying to maintain a relationship with his grandchildren, but it was evident that Darren was turning the children against their late mother's parents. Darren himself appeared everywhere with his new girlfriend Sharon, whom he knew even before Sandra's murder. Then, in 2009, 3 years after his daughter's murder, Larry began to conceive a dark plan for revenge for her death. Fortunately, his plans were put on hold when a new police chief arrived on the island of Kauai, bringing renewed hope for justice to Larry. Police Chief Darryl Perry had been enjoying retirement, but returned to work after the sudden loss of his 26-year-old son. Therefore, he understood the pain of a father who lost a child. After a very emotional meeting with Larry, Chief Perry resolved that Sandra Gallus's case must be solved at all costs. The new police chief enlisted the help of 2 friends in Honolulu, investigators from the cold case department, to review Sandra's case. Perhaps they could notice something that had been overlooked, and indeed, they managed to discover something using advancements that were cutting edge for 2009. Two forensic scientists had the capability to extract DNA from an item touched only once. With this technology, they found Darren's DNA on the victim's shirt and bra. Larry hoped that they were getting closer to solving the case, and the police thought an arrest was imminent. However, the prosecutor deemed it insufficient evidence because Darren never denied seeing his wife every day. The investigation stalled once again. Years continued to pass one after another. In 2012, the police chief assigned the case to a new detective, Bryson Ponce, who thoroughly reviewed all the evidence. The investigation led Bryson Ponce back to the same 2 initial suspects. But which one was the murderer? What evidence pointed against Ryan? Aside from his involvement in smuggling illicit substances, there was something suspicious about how he found the girl's body. He couldn't enter the garage through the closed door and had to call a friend who helped him open it. Perhaps he was seeking to secure a witness. Moreover, he clearly had something to hide and failed a polygraph test. But didn't he have an alibi? Here was another twist. As the new investigator discovered, the time of Sandra's death was more of an estimation. She could have been killed hours earlier when Ryan wasn't at work. However, Darren's position wasn't much more reliable, primarily because he provided completely different statements regarding the events of that morning. Initially, he claimed that Sandra had stopped by to pick up the boys. Then he corrected himself, saying she didn't stop by. He also failed the polygraph test. But here's what's interesting. The couple were battling for custody, and Darren had the idea to keep a diary where he recorded all of his wife's shortcomings, such as when she failed to pick up the children on time. He hoped this would help him gain full custody. Reviewing the diary, investigator Bryson Ponce noticed that entries were made every day from January 1st until the 24th. But on the 25th, the day of the murder, it was blank. If Sandra hadn't shown up at all to pick up the children, Darren would have definitely noted it, given how detailed his previous entries were. Such a gift from her side he wouldn't have missed. After all, he couldn't have known about her death until late in the evening at the earliest. Interestingly, he didn't even call his wife to clarify when she would arrive, perhaps because he knew very well that she would never arrive again. The investigator found something else. Just 3 weeks before Sandra's death, she sent emails to her lawyer describing her husband as a cruel, dangerous man who viewed her as his property and was jealous of Ryan. She detailed how her husband grabbed her, shook her violently, and yelled at her never to call her boyfriend again. He also used the children to his advantage. When Sandra came to pick up the boys at 6 in the morning, he would refuse to open the door for a long time, shouting that he didn't want to wake up so early and demanding that she leave his house because she was allegedly intruding on his property, although he knew perfectly well that the children needed to be fed and taken to school and daycare. After conducting a thorough investigation, Bryson Ponce concluded that on that morning, Sandra did indeed come for the children, but she and Darren had a quarrel, and she was forced to leave without them. Darren, still enraged after the argument, followed her, parked his car on the street a little further from Sandra's house to avoid being noticed by neighbors, and when his wife got out of the car, he attacked her. Then, he simply went back home to the children. The investigator submitted the final report to the police chief and the prosecutor. The district attorney finally agreed to bring the case to trial because everyone believed that no one else but Ponce could do more for the case, and they would not find any new evidence. Darren was charged with his wife's murder. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bail. Sandra's relatives thought that the trial was imminent, but they were mistaken. unexpected circumstances intervene. The district attorney, who agreed to bring Darren's case to trial, lost during re-election to her post, and her successor criticized her work. He stated that she tried to use the high-profile murder case for her own purposes, hoping it would increase her chances of re-election. The new district attorney was convinced that they would not win the case in court because there were two suspects, and the defense would never let this fact rest. And in this case, the second suspect was a convicted felon serving time in federal prison. The court date kept getting postponed, and Larry Mendonca was not getting any younger. He feared that the promise of achieving justice, which he made at his daughter's grave, might not come to fruition, and these thoughts wore him down. Early in the morning on February 14, 2017, the 75-year-old Larry felt unwell. He was taken to the hospital with a heart attack. It was difficult for his son and wife to see him lying in the hospital bed. His condition was quite serious, but he managed to pull through. For months, he underwent physical therapy to be ready for the trial in the summer of 2017, but it was postponed once again. Meanwhile, Darren, his former son-in-law, continued to live his life, attending his children's football games with his new wife, Sharon. In 2017, Ryan Shindo, who had served 10 years in federal prison, was released and decided to speak with the prosecutor. He revealed that he and Sandra had been afraid of Darren because of his aggressive behavior, constantly provoking Ryan to fights. After one altercation at a restaurant, Sandra shouted at her husband, "Don't you dare hit me, Darren." She confessed that he had already allowed himself to hit her. Despite his criminal record, Ryan was not inherently aggressive, unlike Darren, and fully cooperated with the investigation. Finally, at the end of 2017, the district attorney decided that his investigators had completely ruled out Ryan as a suspect, and Darren could be tried for second-degree murder. Suddenly, Darren's lawyer shocked everyone by stating that his client was willing to make a deal with the prosecution, but on his own terms. He agreed not to contest the charge of first-degree assault. In other words, he did not admit guilt in the murder or the assault. However, he agreed to accept punishment for the first-degree assault for causing serious injuries to Sandra. It sounded like mockery of justice, but the prosecutor still wasn't sure if he could prove the man's guilt in the murder and agreed to the deal. Larry Mendonca was disappointed and angry. In 2017, Darren could have been sentenced to either 10 years in prison or probation. This meant that despite brutally strangling his wife, he might not spend a single day behind bars. Everything was supposed to be decided on May 30th, 2018. Larry awaited the start of the trial with a large support group, family members, friends who knew Sandra, and people advocating for justice. 12 years of investigation condensed into an hour of trial. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Would the judge send the defendant home or to prison? As expected, the defense attorney reminded the judge of the alternative suspect. He also reiterated that this was not a murder case, and his client did not admit guilt in anything, only agreeing to punishment for assaulting his wife. Larry also spoke in court. He was given the opportunity to unleash 12 years of pain and despair, starting from that dreadful night when he informed his daughter's mother of her death. How do you tell a woman that the little girl who once fell asleep in her arms, played on her knees, ran to school clutching the lunch she made for her, is gone? Looking at Darren, Larry declared, his family received a life sentence, full of pain, sorrow, and disappointment. A lifelong imprisonment, forever. Darren didn't react to this statement as if it had nothing to do with him. It was time for the judge's decision. Larry was on pins and needles. The judge reiterated the defense attorney's words about the deal and what the defendant agreed to. The attorney whispered to Larry that it didn't promise anything worthwhile. But no, the judge sentenced Darren to the maximum possible term of imprisonment, 10 years. Darren appealed, and his sentence was reduced, but the 12-year struggle for justice for the Mendonca family had come to an end. Larry, Toshi, and their son Lawrence established a foundation and hold annual golf tournaments to raise funds to help victims of domestic violence and to ensure that the public does not forget Sandra's death. Unfortunately, Larry and Toshi failed to reconcile with their grandchildren, who are convinced of their father's innocence and hate their grandparents and even their late mother. By seeking justice for their daughter, Larry and Toshi foresaw this but couldn't act differently. All they have left today are a few rituals on the anniversary of Sandra's death. They bring flowers to her memorial, dine at the restaurant where she worked, and visit the grave where Sandra rests among her ancestors. Sandra, who longed for her native island while away from it, is now forever a part of it. The offended ex-husband, the jealous, despotic boyfriend, the rejected suitor, a one-night stand partner, a teenager with a string of police involvements, or a niece with a better friend. One of these people killed a loving, caring, joyful mother of 3, sending the police on the trail of possible leads to catch the murderer and attempting to seek justice for the victim and her family. The question remains, will justice be served? Nature generously endowed Dana Laskovsky with the best qualities one could find in a person. At 36, Dana was a very beautiful and lively woman, a kind and responsive friend, a talented artist, and a loving mother. Children constituted the most important part of Dana's life. Above all else in the world, she wanted to be a mother, but for some time, she and her husband Sam struggled to have children. However, when their family expanded to 3, Dana and Sam's happiness knew no bounds. Yet in 2000, the couple separated, and Dana, along with the children, moved to a new home in the charming town of Puyallup, Washington. In 2001, she turned her love for children into a profession. Someday she dreamed of opening her own daycare, but for the time being, she worked as a nanny. In addition to this, Dana actively supported her 17-year-old niece, Amanda, during times of difficulty with her parents. For Amanda and her best friend, Emily, Dana was the aunt that every teenager dreams of having. The girls often stayed overnight at Dana's, sought her advice on any matter, and in general considered her more of an older friend than an aunt. The rest of the important people in Dana's life included Mike, whom she met approximately a year after parting ways with her husband. Mike was a pleasant man residing in Canada, but made the effort to visit Dana as often as possible, especially since the drive wasn't too time-consuming. Unfortunately, not everything was smooth in their relationship. Dana's best friend, Shauna, and Mike's best friend, John, didn't speak highly of Mike. The main issue in their relationship was that Dana was a very beautiful woman who often attracted the attention of other men, something that, to put it mildly, did not sit well with Mike. And one of the men who showed interest in Dana, thereby irritating Mike, was Patrick. Patrick worked for a telecommunications company and met Dana when he connected her television after her move. The new neighbor immediately caught Patrick's eye, but she politely rejected his advances. However, he continued to send her flowers and love notes persistently. Initially, Dana probably considered these gestures harmless. When Mike saw flowers from a competitor, he became jealous and very angry. He demanded Patrick's phone number and address, promising to deal with the persistent suitor the same day. Dana did not appreciate this. Firstly, she just wanted to continue ignoring Patrick. Secondly, she didn't want her boyfriend making decisions for her. Mike and Dana argued, and they even decided to temporarily part ways. During this period in August 2001, which coincidentally preceded Dana's death, she had dinner with her friend Shauna. To their surprise, Mike's best friend John joined them. John had recently broken up with his girlfriend, and Dana and Mike were on a break in their relationship. That evening, fueled by alcohol and caught up in the moment, they became involved with each other, much to Mike's dismay. Literally the next day, Dana received a note from her admirer Patrick, in which threatening undertones prevailed. It was probably only then that Dana realized she had a stalker. Patrick hinted that he had been watching her in her home. To her horror, upon inspecting her rooms, she indeed noticed that the protective screen had been removed from the window, as if someone had entered her home that way. Coincidentally, in August 2001, Dana's ex-husband Sam attempted to re-enter her life. Sam arrived unannounced to inform her that he had sold their house. For months after their separation, they had been trying to sell the house, so he bought a bottle of champagne to celebrate this development. Sam hinted at wanting to reconcile, expressing that he wasn't ready for a divorce, but they ended up having another argument, and Sam had to leave. On August 31st, 2001, the family for whom Dana worked as a nanny couldn't reach her. Dana never missed work, and certainly not without informing her employers. The family tried contacting Dana's neighbors, but they also couldn't get through to her. Concerned, they called the police and requested a welfare check to ensure everything was okay. When the police arrived at Dana's home, they knocked on the door. Getting no response, they circled the house and found the back door slightly ajar. Upon entering, they walked through the kitchen and discovered a woman lying face down on the couch. It was Dana, and she was dead. She lay in an unnatural position, with one arm above her head and the other beneath her body twisted in a strange way. Dana's neck showed signs of bruising, It was evident that she had been murdered. The officers immediately secured the crime scene and called in detectives. Examining the crime scene and finding bloodstains on the carpet, investigators concluded that Dana had struggled with someone before her death. After the murder, the assailant placed her on the couch, added a pillow, and covered her with a blanket, as if attempting to make her more comfortable. This strongly suggested that the crime was committed by someone known to Dana. On the other hand, a broken window hinted at a possible robbery gone wrong, especially considering the entire house had been ransacked in search of something. Investigators were perplexed, with half the evidence indicating a personal vendetta and the other half suggesting a robbery. After the autopsy, the forensic pathologist confirmed that Dana had been strangled. The murder was characterized by extreme brutality. Initially, she was severely struck on the head before being strangled, resulting in a broken trachea. This level of force indicated a very strong perpetrator. It seemed likely that the attack was not premeditated, as the killer had to pass through the kitchen, where knives were available, but chose not to use them, and instead opted for bare hands. When a wife is murdered, one of the first focuses of the police is on the husband. It quickly emerged that Sam had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on his wife. The police rushed to find him, but Sam had seemingly disappeared, becoming the prime suspect. As it turned out, Sam had gone on a camping trip with the children. He had no mobile reception throughout the night and was unaware of Dana's death until he returned to civilization and received a barrage of calls and messages. When detectives finally managed to speak with Sam, they noticed bruises on his knees. He explained that he was into baseball and got the bruises during a training session. Regarding his relationship with his wife, Sam mentioned they were not living together, had arguments, but were trying to compromise. When asked where he was on August 30th at the time of the murder, Sam said he was at home with the children, briefly left while they were sleeping, but only to refuel before his upcoming trip. Since Sam couldn't definitively prove where he was at the time of the crime and was not overly cooperative with the police, investigators tried to build a case suggesting he might have gone to see his wife on August 30th, perhaps to discuss child custody, had an argument, and killed Dana. However, his actions didn't fit the timeline of the crime. It seemed implausible for Sam to put the triplets to bed, drive 2 hours to his wife's house just to argue and kill her, then make his way back and nonchalantly take the children for a relaxing outing the next morning. This version of events didn't withstand scrutiny, but suspicions weren't entirely lifted from him either. Surveying friends and family of Dana, investigators shifted their focus to a more likely suspect, Patrick, who had been harassing the woman. Shortly before her death, Dana told friends that Patrick had become fixated on her. She realized he was truly stalking her because he knew about things he couldn't have learned through other means. It reached a point where Dana informed the family she worked for that if she were to die unexpectedly, Patrick would be to blame. Adding to this, witnesses had seen a white van, similar to Patrick's, near Dana's house in the days leading up to the crime, painting a less favorable picture for the investigator. The police obtained a warrant to collect Patrick's DNA and search his home and van. Patrick reacted harshly, being rude and uncooperative when they arrived. However, as officers began the search, Patrick reviewed the search warrant and only then realized they were investigating Dana's murder. He had initially thought they had come to arrest him for harassment. Once he grasped the gravity of the situation, his behavior immediately changed. Patrick agreed to provide fingerprints, a DNA sample, anything to assist the investigation. He also mentioned his whereabouts on the night of the murder. After work, he stayed late with friends. His alibi was fully corroborated. Detectives reluctantly had to acknowledge that Patrick had been incredibly lucky because many witnesses and circumstantial evidence had pointed to him. Deprived of a potential suspect, investigators turned their attention to Mike, Dana's boyfriend. However, before they could talk to the Canadian, they discovered interesting information about him. Dana's best friend, Shauna, reluctantly admitted that Dana was unhappy with Mike's constant control lately. Additionally, Dana had cheated on Mike with his best friend, John. Curiously, John was genuinely in love with Dana, desired a serious relationship, and believed Mike wasn't a suitable match for her. In Dana's infidelity with John, investigators saw a clear motive. Mike could have committed the crime out of revenge, aligning with the theory that the attacker was someone Dana knew. When investigators traveled to Canada and spoke with Mike in person, they saw a man deeply affected by the loss of his loved one. he disclosed that he was already aware of the infidelity and had forgiven Dana. On the night of the crime, he couldn't reach Dana by phone. Displeased with how their last meeting ended, he decided to drive to her. Investigators were optimistic, thinking they finally had a breakthrough in the case with a suitable motive: jealousy. However, Mike continued his narrative, revealing that he was stopped by Border Patrol. They halted him, then turned him back because his driver's license had expired. This information was confirmed by Border Control. While investigators considered the possibility that Mike might have found another way to enter the States, they were beginning to realize that this was yet another dead end. All the likely suspects in Dana's murder had alibis. Frustrated after 5 months of investigation, the Washington police sought assistance from an FBI profiler to help them create a profile of the perpetrator. Notably, they hadn't completely ruled out Dana's husband Sam as a suspect at that point. However, the profiler confidently stated that Sam wasn't the one who killed his wife. If Sam had committed the crime, it would have been planned, and he would have used a weapon. Moreover, Sam could have easily devised an attack plan during the 2-hour drive from his home to hers. The crime wouldn't have occurred on a day when he had custody of the children. Even if it was an unplanned attack, there would have been bruises on Dana's face, because a man in a fit of rage would start with facial blows. Shocked by the news of Sam's innocence, the profiler asked if any of the people they interviewed displayed signs of remorse. He reminded the detectives that Dana knew her killer, and they were now searching for someone haunted by guilt. The police tried to look at the case from a different angle. It was then that they discovered something that matched this rather specific characteristic. In the book where guests could leave farewell messages at Dana's funeral, Amanda, her niece, left a rather interesting note. She apologized to her aunt for not being the best niece, and wrote that she had been sober for 37 days, refraining from any prohibited substances. In principle, these words did not contain anything incriminating, especially considering that the girl had lost her beloved aunt, who had always been a friend and support to her. Nevertheless, there was something in them that made the investigators take a closer look at her. Amanda was invited to the police station for questioning. Now, with Dana, her protector, absent from her life, Amanda found herself in even worse company than before. The girl was genuinely devastated by Dana's murder, and shared that her aunt had always been the person she could turn to when she had problems or when her relationship with her parents was strained. The police asked Amanda if she knew anyone who would go as far as to murder a woman who cared so much for her. They reminded her of how horrifying the last moments of her aunt's life were, possibly even showing her some images, and the girl broke down. She provided the police with the name of one of her friends, Blaine. Amanda told the police that Blaine had a violent temper and had once tried to push her onto the couch and assault her when she rejected his advances. She added that he had also been in Dana's house, and after her murder, he observed the crime scene from across the street while forensic experts worked. Furthermore, after her aunt's murder, she noticed scratches on his hands. Digging into Blaine's past, the police found that he had a history of various offenses. They were eager to talk to him, but there was a problem. Blaine had disappeared. He was living in a southern state, making extradition difficult, and he showed no willingness to cooperate voluntarily. Trying to find a way to question him, the detectives decided to start with interviewing his friends. This led them to his friend, who happened to be in jail at that time. When they explained that they wanted to question Blaine as a suspect in Dana Laskowski's murder, the friend exclaimed, "Wait, Blaine didn't kill Dana. Emily killed Amanda's aunt." Emily, Amanda's close friend who frequently visited Dana's house. The friend added that there was no doubt that Emily did it. They had long nicknamed her Mutant because of her inhuman strength. Emily could defeat anyone in arm wrestling, and her favorite move involved a grip that allowed her to practically choke her sparring partner. It was at this point that investigators realized they had overlooked a potential suspect who stood at only 158 centimeters tall and weighed 54 kilograms. The police brought Emily to the station. She was clearly not inclined to cooperate. She behaved overly confidently, was rude to the police, and when they listed all the witnesses pointing to her, she became furious and declared that she had nothing to do with the crime. She couldn't provide an alibi either. The police obtained a search warrant for her residence, where they found a blouse stolen from Dana. Apparently, Blaine's friends had pointed them to this detail. They revealed that Emily not only stole the blouse but also appeared in it at Dana's funeral. In Emily's apartment, the police also found the girl's diary containing several intriguing entries. Firstly, Emily wrote about Amanda, stating that she could strangle that wretch, just like her aunt. Secondly, the girl had a to-do list for her life, and among the 10 various points, one stood out: kill someone and not get caught. These entries provided a kind of admission and motive, but the detectives understood that this was not sufficient for a confession. Moreover, any defense attorney could easily challenge such evidence. What a 17-year-old girl wrote in her diary might not be taken seriously in court. The police needed to get Amanda's confession. They invited the girl to the station again, this time directly accusing her of leading them astray several times and threatening to charge her as an accomplice. Under pressure, she revealed everything. On the evening of August 30th, when they went to her aunt with Emily, they were under the influence of illicit substances. The teenagers wanted to ask Dana for money, but Emily behaved strangely, rudely, and sharply towards the homeowner, forcing her to ask the girls to leave. Emily refused to leave. Then Dana gently touched the girl's shoulder to escort her to the door, but Emily suddenly became furious. She struck Dana on the head. Interestingly, this detail was not reported by the media, so Amanda could only have known it if she had truly witnessed the murder. After that, Emily applied a choking technique, just as Blaine's friends described. She used a scarf to strangle Dana, showing no intention of stopping. Amanda turned away, unable to watch what was happening. She heard a crunch, then wheezing, and finally, it became very quiet. Dana was dead. The girls took the money they could find and left. Amanda admitted that she did not expect everything to end this way. She thought Emily would simply anger Dana to the point where she would forbid them from coming to her home again. Detectives now understood that the crime was both an attack on a carefully chosen victim and a robbery. On the one hand, the girls needed money. On the other, Emily envied her friend's relationship with her aunt, and out of jealousy, she decided to get rid of Dana once and for all. On March 13, 2003, Emily Lonborg was charged with first-degree murder. She had already turned 18, and they were planning to try her as an adult. However, prosecutors were not confident they could secure a conviction. Emily did not confess to anything. The testimony of Amanda played a significant role, but it couldn't be relied upon since, upon seeing her friend in the defendant's seat, Amanda might retract her statements. If charges were brought against Amanda, she could invoke the right to remain silent. Even with Amanda's testimony, prosecutors were uncertain they could convince the jury that a petite teenage girl could strangle an adult woman with her bare hands. They made what was perhaps the right decision in this case. They negotiated a deal. Emily admitted guilt to involuntary manslaughter and received less than 7 years of imprisonment. Amanda was not charged. Justice, to some extent, prevailed. However, this case leaves a bitter taste because, in prison, Emily exhibited model behavior. Additionally, the time she spent in pre-trial detention was counted towards her sentence. Therefore, after just 5.5 years, she became a free person. She got married, changed her name, and became a mother. Emily Lonborg, who left 3 children without a loving mother, now enjoys the life she stole from her victim. I will tell you a story. It won't be a happy family tale. It's a story about human psychology, control, and manipulation. And the worst part of this story is not the events unfolding in it. The worst part of this story is that it's true. The story begins in a fast food restaurant where Louise, an employee, is about to experience the worst day of her life. However, the day starts like any other. Employees serve customers, do their jobs, when suddenly a phone call interrupts the routine. A police officer informs about a theft that occurred in the restaurant. He claims that Louise stole a wallet from a customer and asks the assistant manager to inspect her personal belongings and confiscate her phone. After the search yields no results, the officer requests the manager to detain the girl until his arrival. And this is just the first of many increasingly questionable requests awaiting her ahead. In April 2004, Louise Ogborn from Mount Washington, Kentucky, celebrated her 18th birthday. As one of the top 10 students, she looked forward to enjoying her last month of school before pursuing a career in medicine. Louise was not only a talented artist and photographer, but also known for her reputation as a responsible and well-mannered young woman. When her mother lost her job due to health issues, Louise decided to temporarily set aside her dream and started contributing financially to her family. In January 2004, she took a part-time job at McDonald's. Earning $6.35 per hour, Louise was considered a reliable employee who never hesitated to take on extra shifts to help her colleagues. On Friday, April 9th at 4:45 p.m., as Louise was preparing to go home after her shift, she was asked to stay a bit longer to cover for a sick colleague. Without hesitation, she agreed, aiming to assist and earn some extra income. At 4:56, the work phone rang, and Donna Summers, a 51-year-old assistant manager for about 8 months, answered the call. The caller identified himself as Officer Scott. Officer Scott claimed that the restaurant's general manager, Lisa Siddons, was also on the line with him. He explained that he was calling because a girl who had recently been in the establishment had her wallet stolen and they suspected someone on Summers' staff. Scott provided a description of the suspect, a young, slender girl with dark hair wearing the restaurant uniform. Summers immediately thought of Louise. Despite Louise having an excellent work record, she fit the description perfectly. Leaving Officer Scott on the line, Summers asked Louise to accompany her to the manager's office. Donna led Louise into the office and locked the door. Donna informed Louise that a police officer accused her of stealing a wallet. Shocked, Louise immediately declared her innocence, stating that she could never steal anything. Donna explained that the police officer had described Louise as a suspect in the theft. Officer Scott was still on the line, and Summers alternated between talking to him and Louise. Scott informed Summers that the girl had a choice. She could consent to a search on the spot, or wait for the officer to arrive, arrest her, and conduct the search at the police station. Learning of these options, Louise began to cry and thought it would be better to go to the police station to resolve the matter there. However, Summers handed the phone to Louise, and after talking to Officer Scott, she agreed to a search right in the restaurant. Scott directed Summers, who relayed instructions to Louise. Initially, Louise was asked to empty her pockets, and she complied without objections. After handing over her keys and mobile phone, Louise showed that there was no stolen wallet in her pockets. However, Scott suspected that it might be hidden under her clothing and ordered her to remove it. It's worth noting that at this point, Kim Dockery, also acting as an assistant manager, arrived for the evening shift. Kim asked what was happening, but Summers refused to explain, following Officer Scott's demand. In the presence of Donna and Kim, Louise reluctantly removed her uniform and was left only in her underwear. She covered her face with her hands and cried while Donna examined her clothing. There was no stolen wallet in her clothes, but this was deemed insufficient. Louise was then ordered to remove the remaining clothes and hand them over to Donna for inspection. Louise complied. All of this became too much for Donna Summers, who started doubting the truthfulness of the accusations against Louise. In response, Scott made a shocking statement. The police were investigating Louise's involvement in more serious crimes, and officers were currently searching her family's home for illicit substances. Thus, Louise's clothing and other belongings were considered evidence in the investigation. Scott ordered Summers to put them in a bag and take them to her car so he could pick them up shortly. During this time, Kim tried to comfort Louise. She gave her an apron to cover herself. As the restaurant was crowded, Kim returned to her work. Summers told the police officer that she also needed to work. Then Officer Scott asked her to find a male employee who would watch over Louise until the police arrived. Summers called 27-year-old restaurant cook Jason Bradley. She left him in the office with Louise and the phone while she returned to her duties. The young man tried not to look at Louise, who was covered with a dirty apron, while listening to Officer Scott's instructions. Learning that Louise had nothing on except the apron, the police officer ordered Jason to take it from her and describe Louise to him. This demand upset Jason. After talking to Scott for just a few minutes, he stormed out of the office and told Donna Summers that he considered it discrimination. He declared to Donna that he wouldn't participate and was going back to the kitchen. Summers didn't understand what had offended Jason and picked up the phone again. She explained to the police officer that there was no one to watch over Louise. In response, Scott asked if she was married. Summers chuckled and admitted that she was engaged. When asked if she trusted her fiancé, Summers naturally answered yes. Scott then asked if her fiancé could come to the restaurant to keep an eye on the girl. Summers agreed to call him. Walter Nix Jr. was a 42-year-old father of two, working as an exterminator and coaching the local youth baseball team. He was generally considered a respected member of the community. He had recently become engaged to Donna Summers. Shortly before 6 p.m., Summers called her fiancé on her mobile phone. She explained that a restaurant employee was suspected of stealing a wallet, and she asked if he could watch over her until the police arrived. Nix agreed. When he arrived at McDonald's, Summers led him into the office and left him alone with Louise and the office phone. Louise stood against the wall, leaning back, crying. As soon as Donna left the office, Officer Scott wasted no time. He ordered Nix to take the apron from Louise and describe her to him. Unlike Jason, Nix complied with this demand. He did not refuse subsequent instructions. Nix forced Louise to stand on a chair to inspect her more thoroughly. Then he compelled her to jump to ensure she wasn't hiding anything of interest to Officer Scott. Occasionally, Nix handed Louise the phone to speak with the police officer. Scott quickly convinced the girl that if she wanted to keep her job, she should cooperate. Donna or Kim would periodically enter the office. Each time Nix heard them approaching, following Officer Scott's orders, he threw the apron to Louise and gestured for her to be quiet, placing a finger to his lips. When the clock showed 6:50 p.m., Louise had spent almost an hour with Nix. Officer Scott's demands were becoming increasingly alarming. When Louise failed to address Nix with a distinctly polite "sir" and continued asking questions, Nix was ordered to slap her. Despite Louise insisting that Scott's demands were absurd, Nix listened to the police officer, not her. A few minutes later, Summers returned to the office. As she approached to grab something, Louise put her head on her shoulder and quietly pleaded for her to take her away. "Donna, please take me out of here, Donna, please. Please believe me, I didn't do anything wrong," the girl said. She asked Summers to call the police, but Summers replied that they were already waiting for the police to arrive. Summers left again. Louise also wanted to escape, but couldn't. The only way out would be to run through the entire restaurant where there were many customers. Additionally, Louise was frightened by Nix's appearance, as he was much taller and weighed 104 kilograms. When Nix and Louise were alone again, Officer Scott resumed his instructions. He made Nix sit the girl on his lap and kiss her to examine her breath. Later, Louise would recount that at this moment, she became paralyzed and felt as if her consciousness had detached from her body. Shortly before 7:30 p.m., Scott demanded something unimaginable, that Louise remove Nix's pants and satisfy him. The girl cried and pleaded, saying, "No, I haven't done anything wrong. This is ridiculous." But Nix threatened her with physical punishment if she did not comply with the police's orders. Finally, Louise gave in. 10 minutes later, at 7:52 p.m., Donna entered the office to retrieve some gift certificates. Louise and Nix, as before, were in different corners of the office. Following Scott's orders, Nix handed the phone to Summers and left the restaurant, getting into his car. When he arrived home, he called a friend, telling him, "I did something incredibly horrible." At the same time, Donna was ordered to find someone to replace Nix in the manager's office. She chose 58-year-old employee Thomas Sims, who wasn't working that day and had just stopped by the restaurant for coffee and dessert. Summers asked the man to accompany her to the office, where Louise was inside. Baffled, Thomas took the phone, and Summers left him alone with the girl. Following the familiar pattern, Officer Scott ordered Thomas to take the apron from Louise and describe her to him. Thomas refused to comply and went out to find Summers. He told her about Scott's outrageous request and stated, "Something is not right here." Thomas demanded to return the girl's clothes and call the police. Summers, shocked, called the restaurant's general manager, Lisa Siddons, who was supposedly on the other line with Officer Scott the entire time. Siddons answered the call with an evidently tired voice, having no idea what Summers was talking about and explaining that she had been sleeping. Once Summers realized she had been deceived, the fake police officer abruptly ended the conversation. By this time, Louise had been in the office for almost 3 hours. Shivering from cold and shock, she asked if she needed to come to work tomorrow. Kim reassured the girl that she could take as much time off as needed. Louise was given back her clothes and allowed to get dressed, while Summers started apologizing. Panicking restaurant employees and managers gathered in the office. After discussing the situation among themselves, around 9 p.m., they decided to call the police. Since the police station was less than a kilometer away, real police officers arrived within just 5 minutes. Buddy Stump, a detective from the city police station, was among the colleagues who arrived at the establishment and couldn't believe his ears when he heard what had happened. The surveillance camera in the office captured everything that occurred with Louise. The video infuriated the detective, and he suspected that someone had made the call using a prepaid phone card from within the McDonald's to observe how the prank unfolded. The next day, the local police chief decided to search for information about similar pranks on the internet. To the surprise of both Chief and Detective Stump, the search yielded hundreds of matches. Similar calls were documented in various states. In each case, the caller pretended to be a police officer or a manager, then asked the store or restaurant manager to assist in an investigation. The requests always involved a thorough search of young women. The prankster targeted fast food chain restaurants in small towns and had been active for 12 years. Interestingly, this wasn't the first incident in Kentucky. In 2000, a McDonald's manager responded to a call from someone claiming to be a police officer. The caller suspected a customer of a crime and convinced the manager to remove her clothes to act as bait for the alleged perpetrator. He guaranteed that undercover officers were monitoring the situation and would come to her rescue before the suspect could harm her. In another incident at a Burger King in Indiana, the fake officer persuaded the manager to search a young female employee. When the girl's father arrived, as usual, to take her home, he had to literally jump over the counter and forcibly make the manager release his daughter. By the end of 2003, there were almost 60 similar incidents reported. Upon learning the extent of the prankster's crimes, Detective Buddy Stamp set a goal to find and apprehend him once and for all. Fortunately, someone in the McDonald's restaurant managed to dial *69 when Officer Scott finished the call. This function allowed them to trace the call. Detective Stamp determined that a prepaid AT&T phone card was used for the call, sold at a Walmart in Panama City, Florida, on April 9th at 3:02 p.m., less than 2 hours before the incident with Louise began. Stamp's colleagues in Panama City connected him with Detective Victor Flaherty, an investigator from Massachusetts, who was probing similar calls to Boston restaurants. Flaherty also linked the Boston calls to prepaid AT&T cards sold in Panama City supermarkets. By comparing surveillance camera images of card buyers at Walmart, the police discovered that the person of interest was a man in the uniform of a local prison supervisor. They quickly identified the suspect as 38-year-old David Stewart. Stewart was married and raising 5 children, having worked in the prison for 11 months. Previously, he had worked as a security guard in a shopping center and as a truck driver. Flaherty went to Stewart's home, introduced himself, and asked if he had a prepaid phone card. The man sweated profusely and inquired if anyone was harmed. When told that no one was physically harmed, but the psychological recovery would take years, he exclaimed, "Finally, it's all over." Despite his exclamation, Stewart denied any knowledge of the calls or having a phone card. He called a lawyer and invoked his right to remain silent. Police searched Stewart's trailer home, finding numerous police journals and dozens of rejected police job applications. Only one phone card was found in the trailer, and it turned out to be not the one used for the call to McDonald's in Kentucky, Mount Washington, although it was used for 9 other calls in 2003. Law enforcement in Mount Washington charged Stewart, and he was transferred to Kentucky. In case of a guilty verdict, he faced a 15-year prison sentence. Around the same time, Louise agreed to give an interview and share what happened during that incident. She explained how she trusted Donna Sammers, believing that as an assistant manager, she would take care of her employees. Louise confessed that her greatest desire at that moment was to escape from the office, but in her perception, fleeing from the office would be equivalent to fleeing from the police. Additionally, her family depended financially on her job, and she feared losing it. She also noted that her parents had taught her to obey and not argue when an adult asked her for something. Louise's interview was supplemented with comments from a clinical psychologist who confirmed that her description of feeling as if her consciousness had separated from her body was common among people who had experienced similar situations. As a result of the prank call, Walter Nix faced serious charges. Donna was shown what her fiancé had done to Louise, and she immediately ended her relationship with him. Initially, Summers was suspended from work at the restaurant and later dismissed. McDonald's cited a violation of company rules, specifically that the woman brought a stranger into the office, as the reason for her dismissal. Summers was also charged with unlawful imprisonment. Her colleague, Kim Dockery, was transferred to another restaurant. Collectively, the charges against Nix could have led to a 20-year prison sentence. In February 2006, he pleaded guilty to assault and unlawful imprisonment in exchange for a 5-year prison term. He claimed that he himself became a victim because he sincerely believed in following the police officer's orders, even when the orders became inhumane. During the trial, he apologized to Louise. Summers was sentenced to a year of probation, although the prosecutor insisted on actual imprisonment. He explained, "It didn't matter whether Summers thought she was dealing with a police officer or not. If the President of the United States ordered to take a girl's clothes and lock her in a room, there would be no justification for that." However, some leniency was shown towards her after Louise revealed that her manager had been deceived and she became another victim of the crime. The trial of Stewart began on October 24, 2006, following the court decisions in the cases of Nix and Summers so they could testify against him. Nix claimed in court that he simply followed Officer Scott's instructions. Donna asserted that she spoke with three, as it seemed to her, different people and heard a police raid in the background. Moreover, Scott knew the names of several employees and a customer in the restaurant, claiming that the general manager of the establishment, Lisa, was on the other line, so Donna believed she was talking to a real police officer. Detective Stamp questioned how Stewart could know the names of the employees and customers. He replied that he did not know because investigators could never confirm these claims. The bombshell effect was produced by the testimony of Thomas Sims, a restaurant worker who put an end to the cruel prank. According to him, Louise said she would receive a substantial check as a result of what she went through. Thomas admitted that he never reported this statement to the police and only informed McDonald's management. Stewart's lawyers skillfully used this testimony to suggest that Louise staged the entire incident to demand compensation from McDonald's. The defense also argued that the prosecution lacked sufficient evidence, and the discovered phone card was not the one used to make the call to McDonald's in Kentucky, Mount Washington. Furthermore, the fact that Stewart bought the card does not prove that he used it. On October 31st, the jury found Stewart not guilty and all charges were dropped. Despite this, the prosecutors were convinced that they caught the right person, as there were no calls from the prankster since his arrest. Louise filed a $200 million civil lawsuit against McDonald's, blaming the company for not informing employees about the prankster, even though the company knew about the prankster for at least 2 years. There were about 30 other calls to McDonald's, and 12 cases resulted in lawsuits in 4 different states. All these cases ended in out-of-court settlements. Louise's case was the only one that went to trial. The jury was given 12 possible verdict options. They deliberated for a long time and finally decided that part of the blame for what happened lay with the prankster, and the other part was on McDonald's. They ruled that the company would pay Louise over $6 million. It later became known that the jury members took a long time to deliberate because they couldn't agree on the compensation amount for Louise. One juror wanted to give her $100 million, while another insisted on just $1. As a result of an unsuccessful appeal, McDonald's was obliged to pay an additional $2.4 million to cover legal expenses. Incredibly, Donna also filed a $50 million lawsuit against McDonald's, claiming that the management did not warn restaurant managers about the prankster. In response, McDonald's stated that they initially did not inform managers because they did not want them to refuse to cooperate with real police officers. However, a few days before the incident in Kentucky, they did send a voice message to managers with a warning. They also argued that the strip search went against their rules since 2001, something Summers should have known. The company's representatives blamed Summers and Nix for the incident, as well as Louise herself, noting that all three should have understood that the call was a prank. Nevertheless, the jury decided to award Donna over $1.1 million, although the amount was later reduced to $500,000. Louise never returned to work at McDonald's. The incident left an indelible mark on her, and she had to take a long time to recover from the cruel prank. She was too traumatized to attend college as she had planned. Nevertheless, she gradually began to recover. She found a job at a law firm, met a nice young man, and soon became a mother. After receiving compensation, she admitted that she would use the funds to study law since her initial plans to become a medical professional were shattered. You never know how you'll act until you find yourself in a specific situation. One might wonder what's wrong with Donna or Nix, but more than 60 people acted exactly like Donna Summers. Why do we so easily obey orders, even when we know they are wrong? Why are we willing to inflict pain on others if someone else takes responsibility for it? There are a couple of well-known experiments that explain how the prankster managed to turn people into his puppets. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted what is now known as the Milgram experiment on obedience in psychology. The professor told participants that he was studying the learning process But in reality, he was studying people's willingness to obey authority figures. Participants were asked to administer electric shocks with increasing voltage to people who incorrectly answered questions. In reality, these people were actors who did not suffer from electric shocks. However, the experiment showed that over 65% of participants would administer the maximum voltage to an innocent learner just because a person in a white lab coat told them to. In 1971, Professor Philip Zimbardo conducted a similar experiment known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. He divided student volunteers into two groups, with some becoming prisoners and others guards. The professor studied the psychological effect of obtained power. The experiment had to be terminated after just 6 days because the students quickly immersed themselves in their roles, and the guards began to show aggression towards the prisoners. Professor Zimbardo later hired a consultant from one of the fast food restaurant chains who became a victim of the prankster. He concluded that the criminal had read Milgram's work because he applied basic techniques of gaining control over people. The caller presented himself as a person with authority. He insisted on being treated with pronounced respect, using such terms as "sir." The caller told people that he took full responsibility and all consequences of what was happening. In case of resistance, he told people that they had to continue because they had no other choice. A woman walking or running alone on a trail. This image is often associated with a dense forest, where a thin, winding path leads deeper into it, and rays of light barely penetrate through the thick tree canopy. It's a place where an unsuspecting victim could be dragged off the trail, and nobody would hear her scream. But what if it's a sun-drenched, highly popular pathway located right in the heart of the city, where people stroll almost at any time? The attack on Katie Lorek happened precisely in such a wonderfully safe place. And that's the scariest part, because it confirms that a nightmare can become a reality in an instant. And something like this could happen to any one of us. Kathleen Louise Ayello Lorek, known as Katie, was born in New Mexico but grew up in California, where she met her future husband, Jeffrey Lyon. The young couple got married and they had 3 children, but despite 20 years together, the family eventually fell apart. Their divorce was a challenging process and was officially finalized in 1997. However, it turned out to be beneficial for the 44-year-old woman. Her friend recalls that Katie had always been a lively person, but after the divorce, she simply blossomed. Over the next 3 years, Katie advanced in her career, working as an assistant in Sistren Donner in Concord, California. It was a very successful and prominent company, and Katie held a high position in the office. A new, wonderful chapter began in her life. Her children were almost grown, she loved her job, and she started dating again. Despite being over 40, due to her excellent physical condition, grooming, and joyful attitude toward life, she attracted a lot of attention. At work, Katie introduced her son to one of her colleagues. The man's name was Johannes Lorek. There was an instant spark between them, and with Johannes, Katie felt she could be herself. They started dating, although their meetings were not very frequent because Johannes lived in Austria. However, they traveled together, had romantic weekends, and enjoyed skiing. In 2003, during a trip to a lake in Switzerland where they had gone for a skiing excursion, Johannes knelt down and asked Katie to marry him. She would have been happy to spend the rest of her life with Johannes, and just a few weeks later he came to the United States and they got married. The couple planned to live in Austria. After all, there was nothing truly tying the woman to the States. Her sons and daughter had grown up and supported her new relationship. Everyone who knew Katie wanted her to be happy, and it seemed like everything was heading that way in her marriage to Johannes. Meanwhile, Katie worked her last few weeks at the company, where her colleagues had practically become her family members. She was always ready to help her colleagues, genuinely concerned about each one of them, and was highly appreciated for it. However, no matter how open and caring Katie was, even she needed a breather. Her respite became the daily walks along a trail that started behind the parking lot of her office. During every lunch break, she would put on comfortable sport shoes and stroll along a trail slightly over 20 kilometers long. The Contra Costa Canal Trail passes through several residential neighborhoods, offices, and is surrounded by moderately dense but perfectly suitable greenery for walks. Besides enjoying the fresh air, Katie valued this time because she could make personal calls, especially to her husband. In Austria, it was around 9 o'clock in the evening, making it comfortable for the spouses to communicate. So, on Tuesday, May 13, 2003, colleagues saw Katie as usual at 12:40 p.m. She kicked off her office shoes, put on her sneakers, and left the office. just as she did every weekday. One might think that taking a solitary walk along a trail amidst shrubbery could be risky for an attractive woman, and in case of any danger, nobody would hear her scream. But this specific trail was nothing like that. Not only did it pass by residential homes and businesses, but people were constantly walking, jogging, walking dogs, and biking along it. It was nearly impossible to find a time during midday when the trail was deserted, yet someone managed to do so. Katie was deeply engaged in a conversation with her husband when he heard her either muffle a scream or sharply inhale before the phone disconnected. Johannes tried calling his wife back, assuming she might have simply stumbled and dropped her phone, but all calls went to voicemail. He knew Katie would call back, understanding that her abrupt end to the conversation might worry him, so he called her office to alert her colleagues. By that time, they were already concerned. Katie was punctual to the minute, and when she didn't return after lunch, they began searching for her. Johannes's call further troubled them. They knew what needed to be done. It was around 3 p.m. when the police were notified of Katie Lorek's disappearance. Credit must be given to the police. They didn't take the disappearance of an adult woman lightly and responded promptly. Just a few minutes after the call to the police, they dispatched officers to the trail since colleagues mentioned she should be there. The officers searched for her on foot, on motorcycles, and called in K9 units. The dog indeed led the K9 unit in the same direction the missing woman used to enjoy walking, so the officers knew they were on the right track. But how could she simply vanish in broad daylight? The search quickly led the K9 unit to a bloody trail on the pathway. It wasn't just a few drops, it was a very distinct trail, as if an injured person had been dragged from the trail into the bushes, but that wasn't all they found. A sneaker caught their eye, lying nearby in a pool of blood. Then they saw the body of a woman lying in the mud. She was in a small depression, covered in blood, her hair matted with it. She was naked, with a bra featuring an animal print lying on the grass nearby, along with black leggings, another sneaker, and a jacket. It seemed as though someone had forcibly removed items of clothing from the victim in a hurried manner. It was evident to the officers that the attack had turned violent, a brutal assault on an unprotected woman. Police immediately checked for signs of life in Katie, and despite all the injuries, it turned out she was still alive. The arriving paramedics swiftly transported her to the nearest hospital within minutes. Her condition was extremely fragile, and they were determined to help her. But at 4:54 p.m., they were compelled to pronounce Katie Lorek deceased. Once Katie was taken to the hospital, the forensic specialists aimed to preserve as much evidence as possible, but it was already too late. When it was discovered that Katie was still alive, the medical team worked urgently to save her life, and therefore, they couldn't act cautiously to preserve evidence. They cannot be blamed. It's essential to prioritize saving the life of the victim in such cases. Consequently, some evidence was compromised. However, the police almost immediately discovered something crucial: the weapon used in the crime. It turned out to be a part of a fence post. It was taken from the section of the barrier that had long been rusted. They surmised that whoever the perpetrator was, they had broken off a part of the post just before the attack. Perhaps the crime was impulsive rather than planned. Therefore, nobody paid attention to the strange object in the assailant's hands, as it seemed harmless. While Katie was on the phone with her husband, she didn't see someone approaching or running up behind her. The attacker repeatedly struck her on the head. At least one blow must have caused her to weaken or lose consciousness, preventing her from screaming, and the assailant had the opportunity to drag her into the bushes without resistance. The murder weapon was covered in blood and was found next to the pool of blood where Katie was discovered. The forensic expert concluded that Katie died from head injuries. However, before that, the killer spent quite some time with her, committing various acts of violence. He left his semen on her body and skin particles on the murder weapon, which allowed the experts to retrieve his DNA. The DNA was cross-checked with the database, but there were no matches. After spending 2 hours at the crime scene, officers realized something was missing. Katie was on the phone during the attack. So where was her phone? It turned out the phone was on, and a ping led the police to an apartment building where 23-year-old Juan Sanchez lived. However, if investigators thought they would quickly arrest the suspect and close the case, it wasn't so simple. The young man explained that he was biking on the trail when he stumbled upon the phone without its owner nearby, so he assumed it was okay to take it. Juan showed the police where he found the gadget, and it was right near the crime scene. His words were trustworthy but not entirely convincing. He was asked to provide a DNA sample, and he readily agreed. Preemptively, it soon became clear that Juan was telling the truth. His DNA did not match the sample. He had merely found the victim's phone and was not the killer. However, since DNA comparison was going to take some time, the police delved into Katie's life. In such a fierce attack, the perpetrator is usually someone known to the victim, especially if the victim is a woman. First and foremost, detectives focused on Katie's ex-husband. What if the woman's second marriage had triggered jealousy and rage in him? However, despite the difficult divorce, there were no signs of animosity between the former spouses. Furthermore, Jeffrey had an alibi which ruled him out as a suspect. Before marrying Johannes, Katie was dating another man who lived in Germany, but on the day of the murder, he happened to be in the city due to interesting circumstances. Moreover, Katie had met him just 2 days before her death. Yet again, they couldn't link the man to the crime scene or establish a motive. What if the new man in the woman's life was responsible for her death? It wouldn't be the first time a man didn't want to be tied down by the bonds of marriage, but wasn't content with a divorce either. Usually money becomes a factor, such as insurance. Certainly, Johannes was thousands of kilometers away from his wife and spoke to her on the phone. On the other hand, he knew her schedule better than anyone, knew where she would be and at what time. Could he have hired a hitman? However, the murder weapon indicated that it was a spontaneous, not a planned crime. Besides, a hitman would likely have tried to flee the crime scene as quickly as possible rather than tormenting the woman. Everything suggested that the victim and the killer hadn't been acquainted before the incident. Therefore, detectives doubled their efforts to find witnesses who might have noticed something unusual on the trail that day. People recalled walking there themselves or with their pets, going to work, riding bikes. One cyclist remembered a stranger asking him for a cigarette. Overall, it seemed like an ordinary day, not hinting at anything out of the ordinary. Despite the shock that something like this had happened on the trail where they felt safe every day, a few witnesses remembered a man acting strangely. He was pointing at the canal, showing fish, as if trying to attract the attention of passers-by. Two unrelated individuals asked to collaborate with an artist and ended up producing two remarkably realistic and similar composite sketches of this man. The only difference was the sunglasses that the man had on his head. The composite sketches were publicized in the media, and the public was asked for assistance. This prompted hundreds of calls from people eager to help. Furthermore, a reward was offered for assistance in apprehending the killer, $10,000 promised by the police, along with an additional $25,000 offered by Katie's company. The police compared the composite sketches with photos of local men who had been arrested for displaying aggression. The more they looked, the more they believed they had found a suspect, a man who lived in the area and was known to frequent the trail. He had been arrested for minor offenses and for assaulting a judge. His name was John Kaler, a 32-year-old. John was a mechanic who suffered from several mental health issues. He had several offenses on his record, mostly related to driving under the influence and an impulsive attack on a judge right inside the courthouse. At that time, he was in handcuffs and was immediately pulled away from the judge, but the attack was documented. There were no other aggressive actions, especially towards women, registered against him. However, he was remarkably similar to the composite sketches. Additionally, the search efforts lost track specifically on the street where John lived. The police were convinced that this wasn't just a coincidence and that they had apprehended the killer. They even called Katie's relatives and informed them that they had found the prime suspect. Now, they needed to detain him as carefully as possible. The police arrived at John's father's house where he resided. His sister answered their knock. She confirmed they were at the right address, but John was no longer available to talk. John had died. On May 14th, the day after the investigation began, John went to the Golden Gate Bridge and jumped. The police were allowed to search the house. They found another piece of evidence supporting their theory, a pair of sunglasses identical to those in the composite sketch. They discovered clothing with something resembling bloodstains on it, and in John's room there was a newspaper article about Katie's murder, along with the composite sketches of the suspect. What was the police supposed to think? Could this be a coincidence? It seemed like John had committed the crime, realized the police would be onto him soon, and decided to end everything by going to the bridge. The police were confident that they closed the case within 72 hours. The man's body was in the morgue. All they needed was to take his DNA and compare it to the sample found on Katie Lorek. Witnesses identified John Keller from a photograph as the man on the trail that day. The DNA check became merely a formality. Confident in their righteousness, the officers declared to the media that the case was solved and proclaimed that the cruel murderer and rapist, John Keller, had been identified. Journalists descended upon the man's relatives, demanding answers to their questions and not allowing them to mourn their son and brother peacefully. In response, they criticized the detectives for not waiting for the DNA comparison results. John Keller's sister and father were convinced that the police were mistaken. His father stated that it was irresponsible to connect several random facts and fit them into a picture of the murder. They destroyed the reputation of a young man that was already tarnished. "It's unthinkable," he said. The family was distraught. John could no longer defend himself, and they tried to do it for him. John's father underwent a polygraph test to prove that his son was at home at the time of the crime. The polygraph showed that he was telling the truth. A month passed, Katie was buried, and the police were no longer actively investigating, simply waiting for the DNA test results. And finally, that day arrived. The samples didn't match. John hadn't assaulted or killed Katie. It was a massive blow to the investigators. Not only did they lose a month of investigation, but they also intensified the pain of John's family, who had lost a son and brother. Moreover, even after receiving the DNA test results, they didn't inform the public and only acknowledged the truth after John's father's statements. They stubbornly continued to claim that he might be somehow connected to the case. That's when the Keller family offered their own reward of $5,000 to anyone with information about Katie's murder, because they wanted to clear their son's name once and for all. Police took DNA samples from at least 50 men, acquaintances of Katie or resembling the composite sketch, but no matches were found. Then, after 4 months, a breakthrough occurred in the case. Early in the investigation, when questioning witnesses, one man mentioned that during the time frame the police were interested in, he was biking on the trail and stopped to smoke. A stranger approached and asked for a cigarette. The stranger smoked 2 cigarettes and the cyclist smoked 1. They chatted briefly, and that was the end of it. This happened about 60 meters from where Katie was found. The police decided to follow up on this lead, although it had been a week since the crime. They found a spot with 3 cigarette butts on the ground. Fortunately, they hadn't been rained on, and after 4 months, the DNA comparison result came back. The stranger who asked the witness for a cigarette was the rapist and murderer. But now the challenge was how to find him. The only hope lay in the memory of the cyclist. Miraculously, after 4 months, he recalled that the man worked in the telephone marketing field in a neighboring town. There was only one such company in that town, so armed with composite sketches, because that's all they had. The police went there. Employees immediately recognized 38-year-old Robert Ward Fraser in the images. However, he hadn't shown up for work since May, almost immediately after Katie's body was discovered. They couldn't locate him at his address. His former girlfriend confirmed that he had left a long time ago and presumed he might have returned to his hometown, but she wasn't certain. However, she found something useful for the police: Robert's toothbrush. Again, a DNA test would take time, and it wouldn't hurt to investigate the suspect for the time being. The man had a history of legal issues, having been arrested 9 times, particularly for robberies and related to illegal substances. He was known for his aggressive behavior in prison. He closely matched the witnesses' descriptions, and an arrest warrant had been issued in Indiana for violating parole conditions. Contacting the Indiana police, the Concord, California officers couldn't believe their luck when they were informed that Robert had tried to return to his hometown and was naturally arrested. Detectives flew from California to Indiana to talk to him. During the interrogation, the man was relaxed, slouched in his chair, joked, and didn't resemble someone afraid of anything. He confirmed that he lived in California, was near the crime scene, and smoked cigarettes with a cyclist around the time of the murder. Robert admitted he heard about Katie Lorek's case on TV, but when the police clarified if he remembered what the woman looked like, he answered that she had long hair, seemed to be a brunette, and guessed that she had freckles. Caught, thought the officers, he provided information that only the killer could have known. Katie did indeed have freckles, but they were not visible in any of the photos shown in the news. The freckles were not on her face, especially since she used makeup, not on her hands, but on the woman's chest. More precisely, between her breasts, meaning only someone who had seen her naked could know about it. And he couldn't have just guessed that. Detectives informed Robert that they had the perpetrator's DNA, to which he started talking about relieving himself in the bushes. In other words, He chose the same spot as the rapist. However, semen was found on Katie, which was an entirely different story. Robert's defense began to crumble, and the detective tried to press him, showing him the bloodiest photo of the victim and asking what she had done to deserve such a thing. Robert claimed he didn't want to see it and that he was not guilty. He sounded quite convincing. The suspect refused to communicate further without a lawyer, but his confession wasn't necessary. His DNA was taken, and it matched the DNA on Katie and on the murder weapon. Witnesses identified Robert as the person they saw on the trail. He was charged with violence, sodomy, and first-degree murder. He faced the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial took place in May 2006. The prosecutor systematically walked the jury through the events of that day. Robert came to the trail with intentions to satisfy his most base desires. He chose Katie because at that moment there were no witnesses on the trail. He grabbed the first weapon he found and attacked the woman, who was talking to her husband on the phone and was unaware of the danger. The prosecutor stated that what we don't know and will never know is how Katie experienced her last moments of life. She is not here with us to tell whether she begged, cried, pleaded for her life, or if she was even conscious after the first blow while the assailant continued to torment her. He then killed the woman, all for a few moments of pleasure. The defense attorneys tried to save the defendant's life, telling the story of his childhood suffering from both physical and psychological violence. However, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. He awaits the execution of the sentence at San Quentin. On November 6, 1994, Jan Balmain stands on the platform of Newcastle Railway Station, Australia. She cranes her neck, trying to catch sight of the approaching train. Jan eagerly awaits the arrival of her 22-year-old daughter, Ravel, who boarded the train to Sydney. The journey takes just 2 hours. A mother waits, anticipating her daughter, an extraordinarily beautiful blonde with blue eyes, tall and slender, to flutter onto the platform and embrace her. Ravel Balmain lives in the prestigious Sydney suburb of Bellevue Hill, not far from the city center. She is a model and a dancer. She had planned to visit her parents before a work trip to Japan, where her troupe awaited her for their 4th tour. But there is much that Jan doesn't know about her daughter, and on this November day, Ravel does not disembark in Newcastle. Traces of her short life are scattered across Sydney's streets, including items intended to accompany her to Japan, a journey she will never make. 22-year-old Ravel Balmain was close to realizing her dream. As a professional dancer, she had already visited Japan on 3 concert tours and eagerly anticipated her 4th trip. She supplemented her income by modeling, appearing in magazine spreads and product advertisements. Just a few days later, a new issue of a popular Australian magazine featuring Ravel on the cover was scheduled for release, an esteemed accomplishment for a model. Additionally, 4 weeks ago, Ravel met a promising 27-year-old director named Piers Fisher-Pollard. Young, beautiful, and talented, Ravel had high expectations for life, and it seemed like her entire life lay ahead of her. Ravel started dancing at the age of 3. She adored music, jazz, and tap dancing. During her teenage years, she spent a year in a theater school in Britain. However, upon returning from her first concert tour, she realized that performing on stage was her true calling. Unfortunately, it didn't pay as well as she'd hoped, so she juggled dancing with modeling jobs. But even that wasn't enough to cover her bills. Therefore, she decided to improve her financial situation by offering her services to an escort agency. Many girls work in this field for a very short time, facing difficulties, and she was one of them. Much later, Ravel's mother would state that her daughter's decision shocked her family. She had grown up in a loving family, always supportive of their children, and if financial troubles arose, she could have turned to them. The woman speculated that the deeply hidden reason for this decision might have been related to an incident when Ravel was 4 years old and found her 1.5-year-old brother Matthew floating in the pool. He couldn't be saved, and it was very difficult for her parents to recover from this. Perhaps Ravel never managed to overcome it. Nevertheless, in November 1994, Ravel's boyfriend, family, and most of her friends had no idea about her side job. Saturday, November 5th, 1994, was supposed to be her last day working in escort services. At some point, her life took a turn, but after 6 weeks of leading a double life, she was returning to her true love and passion, dance. The day before, she had lunch with her friend Kate Brentnall, who described her as happier than she had ever been. She was very excited about her trip to Japan. Ravel had dyed her hair to a softer, more natural blonde. I thought it was symbolic. I thought she had never looked more beautiful. Sadly, that journey would never take place, because the next evening she disappeared under highly suspicious circumstances. Ravel spent Saturday morning with Piers. In the short time they had been dating, they had become inseparable. However, suddenly Piers developed an intense headache, forcing them to go to the hospital. After seeing the doctor, Ravel suggested having lunch, but Piers declined due to his migraine. Around noon, he escorted her to a bus stop. Ravel headed to the city center while Piers preferred to lie down. At that time, Ravel was working for two different escort agencies. One of them was managed by Jane Stanoyevich and Zoran Stanoyevich. As her boyfriend, Piers, couldn't spend time with her, Ravel called Jane and Zoran's escort agency to inform them that she was available. The administrator replied that she had a 2-hour booking from 4 p.m. It was for a new client, a young man named Gavin Samer, who lived in the eastern suburb of Sydney called Kingsford. Later at 10 p.m., she had another appointment with friends of Zoran from Serbia. Zoran was eager to please his friends and suggested having her accompany them to the hotel because he wanted to offer them the most beautiful girl. Ravel arrived at Gavin Samer's house with a bottle of champagne as requested by Gavin. She was wearing cork wedge shoes, a long skirt, and a tunic. She had a pager. During that time, there were no mobile phones, so escort agencies handed pagers to the girls, sending them messages as new orders came in. At 3:50 p.m., Ravel used Gavin's phone to call the administrator and let them know she had arrived. This was a way for the girl to signal that she felt comfortable at the client's house and that everything was fine. 2 hours later, at 5:50 p.m., she called the administrator again and said the meeting was over and she was leaving, but there was no need to send a driver for her. However, as Gavin later revealed, she didn't leave, but instead arranged to spend an extra hour with him for additional payment. This was a risky practice because the owners of the escort agencies did not approve and sometimes punished the girls for such side jobs, naturally because they didn't receive their share of the profit. While she was with Gavin, her boyfriend Piers messaged her, feeling much better. She told him she lay down to rest. Piers easily believed this as he had no suspicion about her side job. At 7 p.m., she received a message on her pager from her friend Kate Brittle. 15 minutes later, Ravel called back and let her friend know she couldn't talk, but would call from home in an hour after changing, and then they would have a couple of beers together at the Royal Hotel, a popular pub in Sydney. Afterward, she planned to meet Piers. The sun set that day at 7:25 p.m. according to Gavin. That was the last time he saw Ravel when he dropped her off at the nearest pub, the Tomato Inn. He pulled up to the pub, she got out of the car, said goodbye, and entered through the back door. Gavin then went to a store for cigarettes and cider before heading home, watching TV, and going to bed. At 7:53 p.m., Ravel's boyfriend Piers sent her another message on her pager, but she didn't reply. By this time, Piers had met their mutual friend Zoe. They were visiting different bars in the city, and Piers constantly messaged Ravel on her pager so she'd know where to find them. The last time he attempted to contact her was at 2:30 a.m. Then he went home to sleep. She didn't respond to any of his messages. On the following day, November 6th, Ravel's mother, Jen Belmain, stood on the railway platform in Newcastle, awaiting the arrival of the train from Sydney, on which her daughter was supposed to arrive. Ravel's parents were eagerly anticipating their daughter's arrival to have a sort of farewell celebratory dinner, to catch up, chat, share the latest news before she was due to embark on a 2-week rehearsal in Brisbane, followed by her troupe's upcoming 4-month tour in Japan. The train arrived, but Ravel wasn't on it. Jen assumed that her daughter might have missed the early morning train and waited for the next one. However, Ravel still didn't appear. As time passed, Jen realized that something was amiss. She returned home and immediately made phone calls. She contacted her daughter's friend, the apartment neighbor, and hospitals in Sydney, trying to ascertain her whereabouts. When Ravel's apartment neighbor informed Jen that Ravel's room still had an almost fully packed suitcase with her belongings, passport, and ticket to Japan, Jen realized it was time to involve the police. Jen, along with Ravel's apartment neighbor and her boyfriend Piers, reported Ravel missing. However, the police were not swift in commencing an investigation, despite the discovery of Ravel's belongings scattered throughout the Kingsford area, where her last client, Gavin Seymour, resided. Her bag, cosmetics, diary, credit cards, and keys to the Bellevue Hill apartment were found strewn across different streets. One of her high heels was found in a trash bin, while the other was discovered in a nearby block. The plastic casing of her pager was lying in a gutter. On the 5th day after the girl's disappearance, when everything indicated an unfortunate event involving Revel, the police started their investigation. Initially, they explored the version that Revel was abducted on the streets of Kingsford, with the abductor throwing her belongings out of the car window while driving. Wild rumors circulated, suggesting she might have been abducted at the request of an Arabian prince and taken to Saudi Arabia. However, the police attempted to investigate more realistic scenarios. Pierce was the first to be excluded from the list of suspects. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have learned about the girl's double life and became so furious that he killed Revel. However, when informed about her side jobs, it was a double blow for the young man. He had an alibi for the evening of her disappearance, and apart from her family, a few friends, and her roommate, he was one of the few people who insisted on continuing the investigation, demanding a more serious approach to the case. Next in line as a suspect was Gavin. Several suspicious moments arose in his story. He recounted that on that Saturday, when he decided to engage the services of the escort agency, his girlfriend Michelle had left home to visit her family. He hired Revel and paid her $500 for 3 hours. To pay Revel, he pawned Michelle's clarinet and received $250 for it. Additionally, he won $150 at slot machines in the Tomato Inn pub. This summed up to $400. He paid this in cash and another $100 to Revel by check. However, the pub staff couldn't recall cashing out his winnings, and he allegedly lost his family's checkbook. Even in the store where he bought cigarettes and cider, there were no records corresponding to the man's claims. His girlfriend Michelle was, of course, questioned. She flew from Brisbane to Sydney 2 days after Revel's disappearance. Gavin met her at the airport, and she immediately noticed scratches on Gavin's chest and neck. There was also a mark on his finger, as if from a bite. The police also noticed these wounds, but Gavin couldn't explain where they came from, whether from surfing activities or gardening. Michelle also pointed out that Gavin cleaned his car and folded the rear seats, although she added that he often turned the car into a mess, then cleaned it to accommodate his surfboard. Additionally, her incredibly lazy boyfriend laundered the bedding and hung it out to dry just before her arrival. She found it suspicious, but it likely indicated his attempt to hide infidelity rather than criminal activity. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence, the police couldn't even conclusively prove that a crime had occurred. The Revel parents were determined to seek justice for their daughter, but no one was arrested or charged with anything. A member of the Revel family claimed that the police considered Revel's life less valuable because she was promiscuous, hence they half-heartedly conducted the investigation. Gavin's house was searched not immediately after the girl's disappearance, and even then, it was done without a warrant. It was more of a cursory inspection. Gavin's car was checked for DNA and other evidence only after 10 days. Many crucial witnesses were not interviewed and evidence was not gathered. Naturally, the investigation stalled, and there were no developments in it for several years. Only in 1999, after an active campaign by the public, media, and the girl's relatives, did interest in the case resurface, and it was reviewed by the coroner. The detective who led the initial investigation told the coroner that, in the police's opinion, Gavin was the prime suspect in the case. Even Gavin's lawyer, Seymour, was forced to agree that his client was the sole suspect. Gavin worked for the girl's parents' company and at the time was an attractive, successful young man. Additionally, he was quite athletic as he loved surfing. Gavin lived with his girlfriend, Michelle, but when she went to visit her family, he decided to hire an escort. Gavin was the last person seen with Revel. According to him, she spent an additional hour with him before he dropped her off at the Red Tomato Inn, a pub in Kingsford. He parked his car in the back. Revel exited the car, said goodbye, and walked inside through the back door. He then went to a store and headed home. However, nobody at the pub who was present at that time could recall seeing Revel. The owner explicitly stated that they had a different crowd that evening, and if such a girl had entered the pub, everyone would have noticed. Despite Gavin purchasing cider at the store, no one remembered this. In other words, after Revel's last call to her friend from Gavin's house at 7:15 p.m., nothing from Gavin's account was officially confirmed. Moreover, Michelle, now his ex-girlfriend, told the coroner in 1999 that she called Gavin that evening but got no answer. After several attempts, she finally got through at 9:22 p.m. and he sounded agitated. His other ex-girlfriend, who had been involved with him before, stated that after drinking, he could become aggressive and hit her in the face. This raised suspicions further, especially because Gavin had been drinking on Saturday throughout the day and had at least consumed half a bottle of champagne brought by Revel. However, one witness, a young man named Jeremy Coughlin, offered a completely different scenario of what might have happened to Revel. Jeremy was a friend of one of Revel's wealthiest clients, Mark Colton. Jeremy recounted that he and Mark were at a party when, after a few drinks, Mark abruptly said, "Aren't people stupid? Have you heard about Revel Belmain? First, there were rumors about an Arab prince who took her to Saudi Arabia. Nonsense. She's at a depth of 3 meters, and nobody will find her body. That's what you get for deceiving the brothel you work for. The brothel owner wanted her dead because she was damaging his business." Jeremy asked his friend about Mark's relationship with Revel, and he replied that he met her outside the brothel, paying her between $500 to $1,000 a week, which was cheaper than paying the agency $200 per hour. When Mark Colton was questioned, he denied saying anything like that, but he indeed had heard rumors that agencies were threatening employees who saw clients privately. Owners of the agency were also questioned. It turned out that on Revel's last day working at the escort agency, she owed Jane and Zoran money, around $300. However, as explained by Jane, this wasn't considered unusual. While most clients pay with credit cards, some prefer cash, and at the end of each week, the girls in the agency reconcile who owes what to whom. According to Jane, Revel was planning to repay the money owing to a meeting with Zoran's friends scheduled for 10 p.m. However, Zoran claimed he was unaware of such an agreement. In fact, his words contradicted those of his wife on almost every point. Jane described that on the day the girl disappeared, she and Zoran bought a television, had pizza at a pizzeria around 5 p.m., and went home. She didn't work that night because she was heavily pregnant and tired. However, Zoran told the police he didn't work on the evening of the girl's disappearance, literally saying, "No, not on Saturday." He claimed he took the TV to the office, installed it, and returned home around 7 p.m. Yet, 4 years later, during the coroner's inquest, he stated that by saying, "No, not on Saturday," he meant not during the day on Saturday. In reality, he did work that evening and returned home around 2 a.m. He blamed the misunderstanding on the translator. However, later, a linguistic expert confirmed that the original statements of the man were translated correctly. Regardless, Zoran claimed he did not see Revel that night. As the agency's driver, he picked up another girl, Kelly, at 7:15 p.m. He took her to meet his friends at Royal Hotel Park in Darling Harbor, where he waited for 2 hours before driving her to another appointment at the Sheraton Airport Hotel. When he was taking the girl home, he had a flat tire, which he had to fix himself. For 4 years following the girl's disappearance and before the case was considered by the coroner, the police did not interview either Zoran's Serbian friends, who had long since left for Belgrade, or Kelly, Revel's colleague, who provided Zoran's alibi. Partly this was because when Jane Stanojevic gave her initial statement in 1994, she said that Revel was supposed to meet the Serbians at the Swiss Grand Hotel in Bondi. After 4 years, she claimed she had made a mistake and actually meant the Park Royal Hotel in Darling Harbor. It wasn't until 1999 that the police checked the registration records of both hotels, finding no information about the Serbians in either. Only after Zoran's testimony did the police locate Kelly, who reluctantly corroborated his words. However, when the police checked the Sheraton Hotel records, they couldn't find evidence of Kelly or her client being there. Gavin Seymour, the lawyer, was puzzled as to why the girl was miraculously found only now, why she wasn't questioned 4 years ago, and why the police didn't investigate inconsistencies between Zoran's and his wife's statements, which couldn't even agree on whether he was working on November 5th, 1994. In response to all these questions, the chief investigator who led the initial investigation said that he didn't know. The Revel family was deeply upset by what they heard during the coroner's inquest. The police failed to interview many crucial witnesses, and other witnesses, of course, had long forgotten what they had seen over such a period of time. Their lawyer stated that the girl's parents were treated as a nuisance, despite their only desire being to know what happened to their daughter. Didn't they deserve that? Even the coroner was forced to agree that the initial investigation wasn't as thorough as it should have been. After examining the case, the coroner dismissed the theory that Revel staged her own disappearance because there was no evidence to support it. After all, if she wanted to disappear, the timing was extremely inconvenient. She was already planning an extended trip to Japan and would have returned to pursue her career as a model and dancer with renewed vigor, making her short stint as a call girl forgettable. Additionally, her personal life seemed perfect. She and Piers were crazy about each other, and there was nothing indicating that she wanted to run away. On May 28, 1999, the coroner ruled that Revel was murdered on November 5, 1994, by an unknown person or persons. He noted that there wasn't sufficient evidence against the police's main suspect, Gavin Seymour. However, if his name had been hidden from the public eye until then, now everyone knew who was considered the prime suspect in the case. Before the coroner ruled that Revel was murdered, the police had no body or evidence to work with. It was only in 2008 that detectives from the cold case unit sent forensic experts to Gavin's house, due to advancements in technology. Subsequently, detectives went to Tasmania to question Gavin, but he refused to provide DNA. Gavin, once a successful young man, moved to Tasmania and worked as a chef due to being essentially accused without trial of Revel's murder. He led a very secluded life, drank heavily, and hardly interacted with locals. After spending 15 years there, he returned to Sydney in 2018. He only spoke to a journalist once, explaining that the case had cost him job opportunities and felt as though he was punished without being proven guilty. He knew people considered him guilty, but he claimed innocence. In reality, he was more preoccupied with how the case affected him than Revel and her loved ones. However, he stated he didn't kill Revel. He was only guilty of hiring a call girl that day. Revel's parents passed away without receiving answers about their daughter. What happened to her? Who killed her and why? Her sister still hopes the case will progress. Over the years, she searched for her sister's body. Now, she seeks answers. She needs to know who killed Revel. It seems her prayers were answered because in 2021, a new phase of the investigation began. The police announced a reward of $1 million for information leading to Revel's killer's arrest. Additionally, Jane King, former owner of the escort agency and Zoran's ex-wife, made an incredible statement. She said she never thought Gavin Seymour could be involved in Revel's disappearance. However, she now had new evidence supporting Gavin's truth, evidence that would help clear his name, but was not found by the police conducting the initial investigation. Essentially, his whereabouts that evening were confirmed. That's all she could disclose at the moment. This new information turned the investigation upside down. In fact, a series of new facts were discovered in the case, crucial enough to be presented to the coroner in February next year. Yes, it took almost 30 years, but the police identified clear contradictions that shifted the entire focus of the investigation. While old evidence still needs testing with new technologies, the new investigation is focused on Jane's ex-husband Zoran and his constantly changing story. He was one of the main drivers for the company, transporting girls to clients. However, there were always discrepancies in the statements he gave to the police. During the initial interrogation, 10 days after Revel's disappearance, he claimed he wasn't working that night, but was at home with his wife. In 1999, he admitted to being at work, but his new version of events still didn't align because the evidence crucial to his alibi was not found. Revel was supposed to meet Zoran's Serbian friends at 10 p.m., but for some reason, the police never questioned them. Incredibly, in 2021, an anonymous call was made to an organization called Crime Stoppers regarding this man, in the photo, who could be involved in the crime. This likely refers to Bojan Prevalovic, Zoran's friend and Revel's last presumed client. While Jane King never met her husband's friend, she now knows that Zoran arranged something for him the day after the girl's disappearance. He bought a ticket from Australia to Thailand. Essentially, the man Revel was supposed to meet that evening left the country the very next day after her disappearance, and no one bothered to inquire about the reason for such haste or coincidence. In December 2021, a raid was conducted on Zoran's property, revealing cannabis worth $400,000 and exclusive items valued at $150,000. He faced 36 charges and was denied bail. Most importantly, according to the police, the raids were carried out based on information obtained during the new investigation into Revel Belmain's disappearance and presumed murder. A detective explicitly stated they were investigating Zoran's involvement in the crime. However, if Zoran's behavior appears unusual, no less suspicious are the actions of Jane King herself. On the day Revel disappeared, she and Zoran had lunch at a pizza place. The next morning, upon learning that Revel wasn't answering calls or messages, Jane immediately dialed the pizza place's number. A staff member recalls her being in a panic, as if it were crucial for her to secure an alibi. She allegedly said to the staff member, "The police are investigating a murder. Can you confirm that we were at your restaurant?" Jane denies phrasing it this way. She insists she said disappearance. But regardless of whether she said murder or disappearance, why was she in such a hurry to confirm her alibi on the very day Revel, a grown 22-year-old woman, had disappeared just a few hours ago? Where did this rush come from? Why was she so certain that Revel simply missed her last evening order, given that such occurrences had been noted before? Jane King herself hadn't even called the police at that point. Likely, nobody had yet contacted the police, and certainly nobody was conducting an investigation. It seems she was certain that she would be asked where she was that day. One can't help but suspect that Jane and Zoran know more than they want to reveal. At the very least, people who definitely knew where Revel was that evening, apart from her last client, were the escort agency administrator, Jane King, and Zoran Stanovich. The new police investigation leading to the second coroner's inquest, planned for early next year, is in defiance of the apparent difficulties posed by the time elapsed since Revel Belmain's disappearance. However, it currently promises the greatest hope that this dreadful case will be solved. Today, detectives are closer than ever to capturing her killer. In 1994, in the small town of New Haven in the state of New York, 18-year-old Heidi Allen was abducted from the store where she worked. Two brothers were accused of her kidnapping, but two separate trials led to paradoxical outcomes. All charges were dropped against one brother, while the other was found guilty. However, if you thought, well, at least they caught the guy who did it, by the end of this story, you'll likely change your opinion. On April 3, 1994, Easter Sunday, 18-year-old Heidi Allen began her shift at the convenience store attached to the D&W gas station in New Haven, a town in Oswego County, New York. Heidi was a determined and energetic young woman with ambitions of building a career in education or psychological counseling. Devoting much of her time to sports, her tall and robust build made her an invaluable member of volleyball and other teams. Despite her athletic prowess, she maintained a friendly demeanor, and everyone noted her warmth and responsiveness. Heidi had been working at D&W for over 2 years. It was her day off, but she agreed to cover a shift so that her colleague could spend the day with her children. Heidi's shift began at 5:45, and she arrived at work with her boyfriend. This was not unusual, as he often accompanied her to ensure she felt safe while opening the store very early in the morning. Typically, he would wait until the first customers arrived and then go about his day. That's exactly how it played out on April 3rd. Another customer entered the store but didn't see any staff. It might have seemed like the store was closed, but the gas pumps were operational and the lights were on inside. The customer went outside and flagged down a passing patrol car. Sheriff's deputies entered the store, finding everything seemingly in order. There was money in the cash register, and $9.50 was on the counter, left by another customer as payment for fuel and a newspaper. There were no signs of struggle or apparent issues. A security alarm was located under the counter, but it hadn't triggered that day. The officers discovered Heidi's car parked on the street, and her purse and car keys were still in the store. Despite the absence of signs of a struggle, the sheriff's deputies concluded that she might have been abducted, and the search for her began immediately. The state police offered assistance to the sheriff's office in Oswego County with the search for the missing girl. They had the resources to block all exits and ensure the abductor wouldn't escape. However, the sheriff inexplicably declined the offer, stating that his team could handle it on their own. Officers checked the punched receipts at the store's cash register and discovered that the last purchase was made at 7:42 when someone bought 2 packs of cigarettes. It was crucial to find this customer, as they were the last person to see the girl at work. Fortunately, the search for this individual didn't take much time. As soon as the news of Heidi's presumed abduction spread through the town, a man named Richard Thibodeau called the police. He claimed to be the one who was in the store that morning. The girl sold him cigarettes, and he left afterward. When extensive searches for the girl began, local residents, including Richard Thibodeau, his brother Gary, and his wife Teresa, joined in. Around the same time, Christopher Bivens contacted the police, describing how he drove past the store and saw 2 men leading a tall young woman toward a van. He thought one of the men was holding the woman tightly. He admitted he didn't remember the appearance of the van or the men, but noted that they were quite tall. Despite Richard Thibodeau voluntarily contacting the police and assisting in the search for the girl, law enforcement grew suspicious of him due to the timing of his purchase. just minutes before the concerned customer approached the sheriff's deputies. Additionally, he drove a van similar to the one described by Christopher. The police searched Richard's van, but nothing connecting the vehicle or its owner to Heidi was found. Richard willingly provided his fingerprints, blood samples, and hair without objection. Due to suspicions surrounding Richard, investigators turned a closer eye to his brother, Gary Thibodeau. After all, Christopher Bivens saw two men taking the young woman out of the store. Gary explained to detectives that he was still sleeping at home that early morning, and his girlfriend confirmed his alibi. A month later, the police charged Richard Thibodeau with the abduction. Gary was also taken into custody, albeit for a different minor offense unrelated to Heidi's disappearance. While he was in jail, law enforcement managed to build a case against the brothers. Suddenly, two inmates emerged, claiming that Gary had said Heidi was no more and she would never be found. Thus, detectives arrested a man who had voluntarily called the police and reported being in the store that morning. Despite no evidence against him, Richard willingly provided all the necessary samples and underwent a polygraph test. However, it seemed to have little significance. Richard and his brother Gary, a person with an alibi, were charged with first-degree kidnapping. A jury trial was conducted separately for Gary Thibodeau. During the trial, no concrete evidence or forensic testimony was presented, and Heidi was still missing. However, the prosecution was confident in their case. They called a witness who had seen two men with a girl near the store that morning, and jury members heard the statements of two inmates regarding Gary's alleged remarks about Heidi. Although the information provided by the two convicted individuals contradicted not only each other, but also established facts at that time, they were allowed to testify in court. The jurors heard that Heidi disappeared within just 13 minutes between the last recorded cigarette sale and the arrival of sheriff's deputies at the store. During these 13 minutes, the witness saw two men leading the young woman to a car. He described the vehicle as a white van with two dark blue or black doors at the back and two doors of the same color on the right side, along with a wide 6-inch black stripe above the wheels. The same witness, Christopher Bivens, identified the van as the one driven by Richard. However, it's crucial to note the interesting evolution in the testimony of this key prosecution witness. Initially, he could hardly recall anything about the men or the van where Heidi was supposedly placed. Suddenly, he could remember minute details, and the height of the men decreased to match the Thibodeau brothers' heights. Another customer from the store was called to testify. He made a purchase at 7:41, just a minute before Richard bought 2 packs of cigarettes. The man explained that there was a running van in the parking lot, and he assumed it was Richard's. He saw Richard in the store and, for some reason, believed there were 2 men in the van. Essentially, his testimony merely confirmed that Richard Thibodeau was in the store, a fact that Richard did not deny. A 13-year-old girl also provided testimony, claiming to have seen Richard's van parked at Gary's house shortly after Heidi Allen's disappearance. The girl insisted she remembered this because it was Easter Sunday. She had just woken up and looked out the window to see the van. However, after the trial, she recanted her statements, admitting that it could have been a dream. This constituted the evidence presented by the sheriff's deputies. The prosecutors had no concrete evidence linking the Thibodeau brothers to the abduction, no motive for the crime, and no logical explanation for why Richard Thibodeau would buy cigarettes if he intended to abduct the girl. Why not simply pocket the cigarettes when he and his brother allegedly took Heidi out of the store? Despite all this, Gary Thibodeau was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. During Richard's trial, nearly all the same evidence was presented, except for the testimony of the 2 inmates. However, since a different judge presided over the case, and there were different jurors, the outcome of the trial turned out to be entirely different. All charges against Richard were dropped. Richard returned to his family, while Gary began serving his sentence in prison. Gradually, the case of Heidi Allen's abduction began to fade from memory until an unexpected turn occurred in February 2013. A woman named Tanya Priest called the police, claiming she needed to unburden her conscience. She recounted a conversation that took place in 2006 when she gave a ride to her friend Victoria West to the trailer home where she lived with her boyfriend James Steen. The couple invited her inside, and as they chatted about random topics, a news segment about Heidi aired on TV. The girls started discussing what might have happened to her when James suddenly said, "Do you really want to know?" and began his story. It was the last thing the girls expected to hear. Stain revealed that he, along with two friends, Roger Breckenridge and Michael Borer, had abducted Heidi that day, taking her out of the store and putting her into Michael Borer's van. Borer was waiting in the van, meaning that two men took the girl out of the store, just as witness Christopher Bivens had claimed. The men then drove Heidi to the trailer home of Breckenridge's girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott, on Rice Road in the town of Mexico, Oswego County. Steen added that they had long gotten rid of that van, but the body could still be found in a shed in the woods across from where the trailer had been located. When asked why they had committed such a grave act, Steen explained that Heidi was planning to report to the police their involvement in illegal drug trafficking. At first, the friends didn't believe Steen, thinking he wouldn't harm a fly. However, a few years later, when Steen killed his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, who happened to be his cousin, out of jealousy, Tanya Priest was no longer sure that Steen was so harmless. Interestingly, the police initially hesitated to believe Tanya Priest's words, but she was determined not to give up, and the officers eventually yielded to her persistent requests to investigate this version. They assisted Tanya in secretly recording a phone conversation with Roger Breckenridge's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott. In the phone conversation, Westcott admitted knowing about what happened to Heidi Allen and went so far as to say that the men didn't bring the abducted girl into her trailer, but left her in the van. However, when sheriff's deputies questioned Jennifer and presented her with the recording, she evaded and claimed she just wanted to quickly end the conversation with Tanya, agreeing with everything she said. During a polygraph test, she lied about knowing who abducted Heidi Allen. Despite this information, law enforcement did not actively pursue the case. At this point, Tanya reached out to Gary Thibodeau's lawyer because by then, she was convinced of his innocence and wanted to help him secure his release. It's worth noting that the main problem in this case has always been the motive behind the crime. It's entirely unclear why the Thibodeau brothers would kidnap a girl they barely knew. Similarly, the motive for three men to take such a heavy burden upon themselves remains unclear. However, it turns out that such a motive could exist, and law enforcement authorities did not want the truth to come to light. Heidi Allen, an 18-year-old employee at the gas station convenience store, had been a police informant for 3 years. 3 years ago, the girl got into trouble when she was caught by the police during a party her sister wanted to attend. As she was a minor and had put a child who was with her in the car in a dangerous situation, Heidi faced significant problems. In exchange for dropping all charges, the 15-year-old girl made a deal and became a police informant. Although she was a confidential informant, her status was revealed by a bizarre accident. Before she disappeared, Heidi worked with a sheriff's assistant, Chris Van Patten, who accidentally dropped her informant card with a photo and the codename Julia Roberts near the store where she worked. The card was found by Heidi's colleague, Kristen Duell, who returned it to the police. Kristen claimed that she only told her mother about it, but even if the girl told the truth, it is unknown how long the card lay on the ground and how many bystanders could see it. Inmates who testified in court against Gary Thibodeau claimed that Heidi was worried about Gary because he was planning to involve her in illegal dealings with controlled substances. However, firstly, one of these inmates later recanted his statement. Secondly, Heidi's diary was found, where she detailed her life, and there was not a single mention of the Thibodeau brothers. Thirdly, the information that Heidi was, in fact, an informant, allows for the dismissal of these baseless insinuations. The newly revealed information provided an alternative theory about Heidi's abduction, especially considering that her status was compromised, and dangerous people could have learned that she worked for the police. Considering the new details, in 2014, after persistent demands from Gary's lawyers, searches were conducted in 2 cabins in the woods. One was literally opposite the place where Jennifer Westcott lived. Search dogs indicated the potential presence of remains near the cabin. Police found fresh shoe tracks at the site, and inside it was evident that someone had already dismantled the floorboards. However, the forensic examination conducted by the Bureau of Forensic Services did not detect any human remains. It's interesting that when Tanya Priest decided to share what she knew, numerous witnesses from the town immediately came forward, claiming to have heard James Steen, Michael Borer, and Roger Breckenridge boasting about Heidi's abduction. Some of these witnesses asserted that they had reported this to the police on multiple occasions. Even the key prosecution witness, Christopher Bivens, stated that Stain and Breckenridge looked much more like the individuals leading the girl out of the store. However, as he had never seen their photos before, he considered the Tibbet brothers as possible abductors. Around the same time, it was revealed that in 2004, Heidi's cousin, Melissa Searles, found an envelope in her mailbox containing a gold bracelet she had once gifted to Heidi. The envelope had no postage stamp, indicating that it wasn't sent through the mail, but was personally placed in the mailbox. Melissa claimed that she had not reported this discovery to the police for years because the entire family believed Heidi's abductor was already in prison, and there was no need to reopen the case. However, with the new abduction theory, she apparently felt compelled to share this information. In 2015, the appeal process regarding Gary's accusation began. The defense insisted on a new trial due to a wealth of newly revealed information. 52 witnesses, including 3 considered potential new suspects, testified. A key witness was a woman who drove past the D&W store around 6 a.m. on April 3, 1994. She reported seeing an old, rust-covered van with no black stripe down the middle, confirming that it wasn't Richard Thibodeau's van. The defense tried to argue that the 3 men kidnapped the girl, forcing her into Michael Bohr's van, and took her to a cabin in the woods because they feared she would report them to the police. The men, of course, denied everything, but Michael Bohr slipped up by mentioning seeing Heidi's informant card near the store. Furthermore, Bohr told law enforcement that he wasn't a cruel person, so he couldn't have committed such a crime. However, this was untrue. Michael Bohr had previously been accused of kidnapping a young girl, making him, unlike the Thibodeau brothers, capable of such a crime. What's intriguing is that he was obsessed with this case, collecting a whole box of materials related to Heidi's abduction. One entry in his notes was particularly intriguing. He wrote as if a psychic told him that Heidi hid the bracelet behind the car seat. She added that Heidi hid an item where she was held, and all her family members would recognize it. Despite the abundance of new information, Gary lost the appeal after a year of hearings, and he was denied the opportunity for a new trial. From 2015 to 2018, subsequent judicial decisions also prohibited presenting new evidence due to doubts about the reliability of witnesses and the lack of sufficient proof to substantiate the alleged confessions of the 3 men. None of the 3, James Stein, Michael Bohr, or Roger Breckenridge, were charged in connection with Heidi's disappearance. Perhaps if Gary's lawyers had known about another crucial lead, they might have persuaded the judge to allow a new trial. The prosecutor informed the defense that he had provided them with all case materials. However, on December 13, 1994, he explicitly prohibited copying documents from a specific folder for the defense attorneys. Inside were 2 letters from the globally renowned expert in determining truthfulness, Murray Myron. His services were often sought by FBI agents, and he was asked to speak with a witness who might be the one who saw Heidi after her abduction. The expert concluded that Brent Moore's account of specific events related to Heidi was truthful and accurate. He did witness her being transported in a van, and she found refuge in a garage on the Barlow property in the town of Scriba. Brent was only 3 years old at the time of Heidi's abduction, and the expert was invited to verify whether the boy was telling the truth about the events of that day. The expert talked to the child, analyzed his drawings, and believed him. He advised looking for Heidi where the boy indicated. Interestingly, Brent knew Heidi before the abduction. His mother mentioned that during the Christmas holidays, after a visit to Richard Mitten, the boy's father, Brent mentioned seeing Heidi and that she gave money to Richard. When shown a photo of Heidi, the boy immediately recognized her and called her by name. Additionally, he accurately described her car. Brent added that 3 friends of his father were involved in Heidi's abduction, and the boy's mother remembered a conversation with her ex-husband on Easter Sunday in 1994, the day Heidi disappeared. She recalled how Richard suddenly claimed that 3 boys had kidnapped her. Who they were and whether they knew that Heidi was an informant is unknown. Investigators attempted to search the garage indicated by the boy, but couldn't conduct the search on either the garage or the adjacent area due to the lack of a warrant, and the homeowner did not allow the search. As evident, there are several theories about what might have happened to Heidi Allen besides the police's version implicating the Tibbets brothers. It's possible that Stein, Breckenridge, and Bohr were the kidnappers, or perhaps friends of Brent Moore's father were involved. Since the girl was not found, there's also a more optimistic version suggesting that she entered a witness protection program. What if the police realized the danger they put Heidi in by making a teenager a confidential informant and then compromising her status? This could explain many unexplained aspects of the case. The appearance of her bracelet, the lack of signs of struggle in the store, the absence of evidence clearly pointing to any of the suspects. One might want to believe that she had to leave her family, but no one kidnapped her, and she is enjoying life somewhere in this world. Although one thing can be asserted almost certainly, when the sheriff's assistant dropped Heidi's informant card, he put an end to the life she had led until the age of 18. What truly happened on the morning of Sunday, April 3, 1994, remains unknown. It's possible that we may never find out. What we do know is that Gary maintained his innocence until his last breath. Gary Thibodeau passed away on August 12, 2018, at the age of 64, and his health did not allow him to live the additional 2 years to a potential conditional early release. Gary's departure means he will no longer have a chance to clear his name. Hope for another appeal in federal court died with him. He will remain a convicted inmate who abducted an 18-year-old girl and, according to many, is the second victim of this terrible and convoluted crime. What motive for murder would you consider the most trivial? Betrayal, jealousy, or money? Don't rush to answer. This is a tricky question. After all, a jealous person might turn out to be greedy, and an unfaithful wife may burn with jealousy herself. When in a love triangle, each person has their own motive for murder. It won't be easy for the police to figure it out. And then even a killer who no one would dare to call very smart will manage to lead the investigation for 467 days. Growing up in Amarillo, Texas, Robin knew exactly what she wanted in life, even as a child. She wanted to stay at home and take care of her children while her husband provided for the family. Her parents, both military veterans, had a happy marriage that lasted for 40 years, and she dreamed of having a similar relationship. However, things didn't go as planned because she often chose the wrong partners and avoided the good ones as if they were a danger. But above all, Robin feared being alone. She hated being alone, and she was afraid of being alone. Fortunately, thanks to her sociable nature, she got a job as a waitress in a restaurant where there was no shortage of attention from men. And so one evening in 2003, at the age of 22, Robin met a wonderful young man named Jeremy David Spielbauer. Though everyone simply called him JD, 21-year-old JD was gentle, caring, and exceptionally polite. He served in the Marine Corps and had been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He also found work as a mechanic in civilian life. Needless to say, Robin fell head over heels in love with him. Just 2 months later, she joyfully announced to her parents that she and JD were expecting a child. Her parents had only just learned that she was dating someone, but they chose not to argue. Robin moved into JD's and his mother's house. After the birth of their daughter, they decided to get married. Soon, their second daughter was born. However, as is often the case, financial difficulties made life increasingly challenging for the growing family, and conflicts became inevitable. Then, to the surprise of their friends and family, the family began attending the local church about 3 times a week. There, they made new acquaintances, including a young mother of 2, Katie. The girls quickly became friends, but Robin's friend Aaron House looked with suspicion upon JD's newfound religious devotion. She believed that their church attendance was a more trivial reason, a desire to see Katie more often. Unfortunately, she was right. Robin stubbornly turned a blind eye to everything until the day her husband moved in with his lover. Approximately 8 years into their marriage, Robin filed for divorce and returned to live with her parents. JD and Katie got married on November 10th, the founding day of the Marine Corps. Now, JD helped Katie raise her 2 children, but it was clear that Robin hadn't forgotten her ex-husband until she became interested in Jared. It was evident that the young man genuinely liked Robin, and her friends, especially Aaron, were very happy for her. Robin at last regained her old self, rejoiced, and smiled happily, just like before. It seemed like a happy family and a cozy nest were on the horizon for the girl. But this glimmer of hope quickly dimmed one night in April 2014 when Robin got into her car and drove away, never to return home. On the morning of April 8, 2014, Robin's mother noticed her daughter was missing. She assumed that she had stayed with one of her friends, as she had done in the past, and felt somewhat irritated because she needed to go to work and didn't know who would take her grandchild to school. At that moment, it didn't even occur to her that something might have happened to her daughter. On the same day, around noon, A local businessman was driving on the highway when he turned onto Helium Road, and 3 girls ran towards him shouting, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man contacted the rescue service after the girls told him that they had seen a black Chevrolet Tahoe with a girl lying near the rear wheel. She wasn't breathing and wasn't moving. The officers who arrived at the scene concluded that the poor girl had been there for several hours and had suffered a blow to the head with a blunt object. She had no identification, wallet, or phone with her. However, the license plate of the vehicle helped identify the victim as Robin Spielbauer. Robin's parents had to break the terrible news to her daughters and her ex-husband. JD couldn't believe what had happened and couldn't hold back his tears. He immediately went to the family to support the children and his former in-laws. At the same time, the investigators were examining the crime scene. One unusual detail they noticed was the damage to the car's glass. The rear right door's glass had chips and bright pink paint marks. What did this suggest? It indicated that someone had struck the car's glass with a heavy and pink object. However, the detectives had no idea what significance this discovery would have in their investigation. Therefore, they began questioning Robin's acquaintances. Her boyfriend Jared stated that after work, he went home, played video games, and went to sleep. JD also claimed that he was at home, had 2 glasses of beer, and fell asleep. He hadn't come anywhere near Helium Road that evening and had no idea where Robin might have gone, why, or with whom. However, his phone told a completely different story. According to his text messages, he and his ex-wife were planning to meet that evening. The man had to admit that his wife had gone to her friend's place with their son. He had arranged to meet Robin at his home to discuss their children and wanted his uncle to be there in case his wife returned early. However, he forgot about the meeting and simply fell asleep on the couch after his uncle left. He woke up shortly before 10 p.m. with a strange, oppressive feeling. JD messaged his wife and his uncle, asking if everything was okay. At 10:18, he also messaged Robin, but she didn't respond. He tried calling her, but it went to voicemail. Just a few minutes after JD called his ex-wife, Katie arrived at the house. JD's uncle, who had returned to calm his agitated nephew, confirmed that she arrived around 10:20. They talked for a bit, as JD was still feeling uneasy. The detectives noticed that JD seemed to be trying to hint at something and directly stated that he was raising many suspicions. In response, the man claimed that he had his own suspicions but didn't specify what they were. The investigators had no doubt that JD was hiding something, and as they delved into his life, they discovered what it could be. JD had been married to Robin, but he had an affair with Katie. He then divorced Robin, married Katie, and started a new affair, this time with Robin. JD claimed they maintained friendly relations for the sake of the children, but Katie suspected there was more between him and his ex-wife. JD and Katie argued nearly every day, and Robin found it amusing. She wanted Katie to take her own medicine. The 2 women fought for a man they both considered a traitor, and what made him worth fighting for remained a mystery. Robin's friend Aaron even recalled an incident in 2013 when Robin came to Katie's house to pick up the girls. Katie grabbed and pushed her down the stairs, climbed on top, and started beating her. Robin managed to push her off. When Aaron heard about this, she warned her friend not to be alone with Katie because she was one of those crazies who could kill her. 5 months after that fight, Robin was dead. The investigators, of course, spoke with Katie. She admitted not liking Robin, but claimed she never threatened her. However, she stumbled on the same issue her husband did, her own text messages, and not just 1 or 2 messages. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie sent her husband 336 angry messages. It was clear that she was furious and struggling to find a way to vent her anger. Less than an hour before the murder, she sent the following message to her husband. "My dreams of a happy family have evaporated. I won't force you to continue bearing this burden. You started it, whether you want to believe it or not. I will end it." Statements like these, in the eyes of the investigators, turned the jealous wife into a murder suspect. However, Katie had not only a motive, but also an alibi. She and her son spent the evening at her friend Savannah Guinness's house. They left around 10 p.m. and returned home at 10:20, which was confirmed by JD and his uncle. Furthermore, there was no evidence connecting her to the crime scene, at least not at that point. On the same day that investigators were interrogating Katie, the forensic expert conducted an autopsy on Robin. At the crime scene, it appeared that she had died from a severe blow to the head with a blunt object, but the autopsy revealed something more. A .22 caliber bullet had been fired into the back of the victim's head. Now the police began searching for the weapon. Robin's parents, who lived just a few houses away from Katie and JD, watched as the police conducted a search in their former son-in-law's home. The family had an entire arsenal in the house, which was quite common for Texas. However, one small detail caught a lot of attention: a pistol with a bright pink frame, the same caliber as the bullet that killed Robin. A piece of plastic had broken off the pistol. Therefore, the investigators returned to the crime scene and combed the area around where they found the car. They discovered a .22 caliber shell casing and 2 bright pink plastic fragments that obviously matched the pistol. What was particularly intriguing was that before they found the weapon, but after the murder, the investigators had browsed Katie's Facebook page and found a photo of her shooting the very same pink pistol. However, before they could realize the significance of this discovery, she deleted the photo. It seemed like Katie didn't want the police to know about the weapon. But why? Detectives took a closer look at where she was at the time of the murder. You may remember she had an alibi. She and her son spent the evening with Savannah's family and left at 10 p.m. However, Savannah told them that Katie and her son had left at 9:50 or around that time. Just 10 minutes, but they were crucial. It only takes from 3 to 5 minutes to drive from Savannah's house to Helium Road. These 10 minutes cast doubt on Katie's alibi, and her best friend was the one who brought it to light. There was more. At 10:13, Katie's phone pinged at a tower that could be considered close to both Savannah's house and the crime scene. This meant that Katie had the means, opportunity, and motive to commit the murder. The police believed they had everything they needed for an arrest. They arrested Katie in front of her 12-year-old son, Diego. By the way, as all witnesses confirmed, Katie was with her son the entire evening. Wouldn't he have noticed if his mother had stopped the car in the middle of a field, had an argument with someone, and then committed a murder? Especially since Robin had not only been shot, but also struck with a blunt object on the head. The teenager surely would have noticed. But when he was questioned, he said that all he remembered was sitting in the car with his mom and playing games on his phone while they drove around the city. Thus, on April 11, 2014, just 4 days after the murder, the investigators informed Robin's parents about the arrest. Robin's loved ones lost a daughter and a friend. But the consolation for them was that the person responsible for her death, Katie Spielbauer, was behind bars. Is the case closed? Not quite. Katie remained in jail, unable to post bail, while investigators and District Attorney James Farron built their case against her. They soon received assistance from an unexpected source. JD came to the police station and stated something he had maintained all along. He had been at home with his uncle when he received a message from Robin proposing a meetup on Helium Road. This time, JD added to his story by saying that just after 9 p.m., Katie returned home. She was in a bad mood and started an argument. JD, not wanting to fight, went to his bedroom and lay down. When he woke up, he found that his wife had left in his car. That was when a terrible feeling of dread overcame him, and he decided to check if everything was all right. JD and his uncle received responses from Katie, confirming everything was fine, but there was no response from Robin. When the detectives asked JD why he decided to tell them about this now, he explained that the thought of his wife being involved in Robin's murder was driving him insane. The investigators challenged JD's story, which contradicted phone records available to the police. JD's phone pinged at 9:23 while he was on his way to the crime scene. JD then explained that someone else had taken his phone and his car. It was Katie. She saw his messages with his lover and took his phone, his car, and went to confront Robin. But why did Katie hit the car's rear right window with a gun? The detectives were convinced that it was likely the lovers had met on Helium Road, sitting in the back seat of the car when Katie arrived. She fired her gun before JD could react, and now he was torn between his loyalty to Katie and his desire for justice for Robin. After a few more days, JD finally agreed to tell everything. JD and Robin had met on Helium Road, sitting in the car and just talking about the kids. When they noticed headlights approaching, they heard a loud knock on the window, obviously not made by a fist. JD opened the door, and it was Katie. The girls immediately started arguing. JD demanded they stop fighting and reassured Katie that they were just talking about the children. He then went to his car and drove home, convinced that Katie would follow him. But he was wrong, so he sent 2 text messages, asking if everything was okay. JD explained that he hadn't told anyone earlier because he didn't want to believe it, as he still loved Katie, but now it was all over. He filed for divorce and never visited his wife in jail, as she was going to be there for a long time unless she could prove her innocence. When investigators took on the case, it seemed simple and straightforward. It took them 4 days to link Katie to the murder. The prosecutor believed that after some time in jail, Katie would confess. However, even her husband's admission didn't help. Katie demanded a polygraph test. The police provided her with that opportunity, and she took another one. She failed it miserably, but it didn't break her. She still refused to confess. Katie didn't deny her animosity towards her rival, but claimed she would never kill her or arrange someone else to commit murder. The reason lay in her tragic upbringing. Her father died when she was 2, and she buried her mother at 18. Knowing the hardships of growing up without parents, she would never do such a thing to Robin's children. All the evidence against Katie was circumstantial, and they needed something more solid. That's when a breakthrough happened. In the prosecutor's office, someone mentioned a case where smartphones could leave digital footprints when connecting to Wi-Fi networks. Katie's phone had its Wi-Fi turned off, but her son Diego's phone had it on. This meant that investigators could track Diego's every move and, consequently, that of his mother that night. Since all the witnesses consistently stated that the teenager was always with his mother, tracing Diego's phone could lead them to Katie. The prosecutor instructed his assistants to obtain this information, and it took months to do so. When the data was finally acquired, the prosecutor met with Katie. By that time, she had spent 467 days in jail awaiting trial. The prosecutor told Katie that he considered this information the final piece needed. He was confident that it would send her to prison for life, but it turned out to be the key to her freedom, allowing her to reunite with her children. She couldn't believe it, breaking down in tears due to the overwhelming emotions. She admitted that during her time in jail, she had harbored the darkest thoughts, fearing that if she were found guilty, she would have to be carried out in a body bag. She would prefer her children to believe their mother had passed away rather than having her incarcerated for murder. Suddenly, with the snap of fingers, she was free. Within hours, the case against her was closed, and she was released. A happy ending? Not quite, as if Katie was innocent. It meant that someone else got away with murder. The prosecutor publicly admitted his mistake. He realized that J.D. had outsmarted him simply because everyone underestimated him, believing he wasn't clever enough to orchestrate a murder. Although there was a small arsenal in his home, he chose the pink gun, which often jammed after the first shot, solely because it belonged to Katie. He could have disposed of it in the desert where it might never be found, but he brought it back home. Moreover, surveillance cameras captured a car similar to his near the crime scene at approximately the time of the murder. Although the face and license plate weren't visible, investigators were convinced it was J.D. behind the wheel, and no car remotely resembling Katie's was seen there. But the most significant lie he told was not about the night of the murder, but his past. J.D. had never served in the Marine Corps or any other military branch, nor had he been to Iraq or Afghanistan. All those stories were fabrications to impress women like Katie, whose parents had military ties, something that spoke volumes about his character. The prosecutor was certain that at some point before Robin's murder, she had told J.D. that she had met someone else and they would no longer be lovers. Additionally, she had expressed her desire to finally receive full child support payments. J.D.'s scheme was simple: kill Robin to get rid of her, frame Katie to eliminate her as well, and then remain financially stable while finding a younger and more agreeable girlfriend. This would solve all his problems. However, the prosecutor hesitated to press charges, and 9 months later, Robin's mother called him. It turned out J.D. had asked her to do him a favor and buy him a ticket to New York, claiming he needed to go there for the weekend. Presumably, he planned to flee since it was just a short distance from New York to the Canadian border. This prompted the prosecutor to take action, but an arrest doesn't equal a conviction. That's why he took another unexpected step by inviting Katie as a witness in the case. The prosecutor was confident that his earlier mistake would now help convict J.D. Robin was killed with a pink gun, and either J.D. or Katie had to be the murderer. It was certainly not Katie. The defense argued that if Robin had been severely beaten and then shot, it pointed towards Katie as the perpetrator because both actions could have killed her, suggesting the murderer was in a state of rage. Moreover, J.D. couldn't have framed Katie easily because he wasn't smart enough for such a plan. If he wanted to frame his wife, he would have ensured that she had no alibi. J.D. could have been sentenced to death if the jury believed that the crime included a robbery because Robin's phone and wallet went missing, and later Her daughter's documents were found in JD's car. However, the jury decided that this was more likely a theft than a robbery. Therefore, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after April 20th, 2046, when he would be 63 years old. Justice was served for Robin, but her parents still felt the pain of the thought that their daughter's greatest fear came true when JD left her alone on that remote road. In January 2020, the case took an unexpected turn. The appellate court overturned JD's conviction. It turned out that 2 jurors had formed opinions about the defendant and the case before the trial, which was not allowed by the procedure. Additionally, JD had complained about the performance of his lawyers. In 2021, the court found no issues with the jury selection process. However, the case was once again sent back to the appellate court to assess JD's complaint about his attorneys. It's important to note that the appellate court did not conclude that the man was innocent, but rather that there was a procedural error. Even if JD's trial is conducted again, Katie, who currently works at a law firm, has promised to be present on behalf of Robin to ensure that justice prevails once more. Katie herself has become the director of a company that helps teenagers and adults overcome emotional and physical traumas and change their lives for the better through sports.